Saturday, April the 24th, 1982, Tazria Metzora. I would like to thank again Rabbi Mordecai DeWittis for speaking from this pulpit last week in my absence at the annual retreat of the SAJ. I hope we will welcome many congregants next weekend at the Kala of Reconstructionist movement, which will take place for high school students here. We have a large gathering of young people who are coming in from all parts of the campus, and there are many activities, but for the congregation, the opportunity to greet these young people will take place on Shabbat morning. So I hope we will turn out in large numbers, and I hope to address my remarks to them on the subject of Reconstructionism in terms of where they are coming from. They come from a variety of different congregational backgrounds and settings. I want to talk about a topic I don't normally talk about in synagogue, a movie. Actually, I saw two movies this week. After the retreat, I felt I deserved a break. And the two movies were, they should not really have been done in one run, that is to say, one after the other. You know, when you had a dearth of movies, sometimes you feel the need to go to one after the other. At least that's how I do it, and then lay off for a while. The two movies should have been seen completely independently. Seeing them together created a kind of a negative, almost diabolical synergy. The two movies were Mephisto and Dinah. Do I pronounce that properly? My son tells me I sound as if I came from the Bronx. How is that pronounced? Yes? You're not supposed to roll the R? How am I supposed to know? I just go by the criticism that I get. The sense of pain was roused by the fact, of course, that Mephisto is a movie about the Holocaust, and I didn't know it when I went to see it. I went on the say-so of, Paul, could I have a glass of water, please, before I break out? Oh, he is, thank you. I thought there was a board meeting taking place to decide on the issue. One never knows these days. A friend of mine who always sees the best movies first, the ones that always get the prizes years afterwards, told me that I should go and see it, so I went to see it. The other one did not belong in parallel, as it were, for the reason that it reminded me of the fact, I suspect that Dinah is about a group of high school students who are sort of between leaving high school, college, getting married, and making out with as many girls as they can. I get the impression that the time was during the 40s. As late as that? You're quite sure? They're way after high school. It just goes to show, the older you get, the younger people look. Thank you. At any rate, rightly or wrongly, it brought to my mind I suppose it was the wedding at the end and the rabbi and that rabbinical voice. It was the one that Jack Levithan is so happy with, the rabbi who was able to pronounce God as a multi-syllabic word. Jack, there's your rabbi in that movie at the end. I was very surprised that they were Jews. I mean, they looked like Americans. They made a study once, after the war was over, about what Jews were doing, what congregational Jews were doing. between 1940, 41, 42, 43, 44, when millions of Jews were being done to a horrible death on the continent. And even after information came out that Jews were being done to death on the continent in large numbers. And the answer is nothing. A survey made of congregational bulletins of the Holocaust period showed that congregations were preoccupied with the trivia that congregations tend to be preoccupied with on an ongoing basis. That the issue still was whether social halls were big enough for bar mitzvahs, who should have bar mitzvahs, who poured the tea at the sisterhood party, which hotel the sisterhood luncheon would take place. In other words, while Jews were dying in concentration camps, theological, synagogal, spiritual business went on as usual. I may have misjudged the actual dates of this second movie, but the ethos, the atmosphere, was very much redolent to that period. You know, having your car, borrowing your parents' car, making it out, going to the motels, practical jokes. This is not a criticism. It's not a criticism, but it did raise the question. It did raise the question of how easy it is to ignore completely what is going on in the world Ethan, would you like to come and do this bit? You're so much better at this. You're so much better at this one than I am. I would prefer members of the congregation who wish to jog to use the bridle path and not the main aisle of the synagogue during the sermon, if you don't mind. The incredible insensitivity, and the question I wanted to raise was we Jews find it much easier to aggravate ourselves by sorrows we can't do anything about than being sensitive to issues we can do something about. And that has become a major industry in Jewish life today. Getting very preoccupied and busy about trivialities and ignoring some very serious issues. And this leads me to Mephisto, which is not a movie about the Holocaust, although I said that it was. It's not a movie about the Holocaust, and therefore it is. Mephisto, of course, is an abbreviation for Mephistopheles, one of the main characters of Goethe's Faust, the theme of which is the man who sells his soul to the devil. And of course, Goethe was not the first in the field to write a play on this theme, but for many of us, his version of that theme has become the most beautiful, the most striking, and perhaps the most brilliant literary expression. One might say, since I'm speaking in a synagogue on this topic, that the movie is a midrash on the theme of Faust. That is to say, a commentary which tries to elucidate the deeper meaning of selling out, I suppose. Selling out. I think that's what the movie is about. And in a sense, it does for the theme of Faust what the classical plays of the 5th and the 4th pre-Christian century in Greece did for the ancient myths which the Greeks had inherited from the past. All those plays that Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides write are not original plays. What they have done is they have taken mythological themes which are older almost than the Greek people themselves and utilized those themes as a framework on which to hang current concerns and interests. This is the power of those ancient myths is such that even in our own day, distinguished playwrights have picked up those mythological themes and endeavored to rewrite them I'm just thinking one or two examples. Jean Arnaoui, for example, wrote a version of Antigone. And I'm sure, since we asked the congregation to participate, I'm feeling a bit schwach this morning. I've got a sore throat. Could you give me some more examples of modern dramatists that have taken classical myths and rewrote them in terms of, huh? Yes, Morning Becomes Electra is a beautiful example. Any more examples? Yes, JB? JB, that would be one. I was thinking more of the Greek writers. Any more? Would you like to stand up for a moment and enlighten me on that topic? Because I'm not very learned on that topic.
If anybody knows Martha Graham's dances, they know how filled with weakness they are.
Would you say that she tries to reinterpret them in terms of modern issues?
I suppose she does. I don't know. Doesn't anybody else want to help me out?
Well, that's very difficult. That's what I'm trying to do, and you're throwing it back to me. Doesn't anybody else? Do we have an expert, Lois? My resident Martha Graham expert, please stand and give us a, well, just don't say she does, give us a word on the topic.
She takes Greek myths and she distills the character, especially the men, and this is what her dances were about, distillation.
Okay, right. Louder, well, what can I do? She agrees with you. Let me, since I say that the Mephisto movie, sorry, do you have another one? Yeah, I know. I saw that article. Yes, of commercials. Yes, it was last Saturday. How could I forget? We were at the retreat, and it was called Iliad and Oddity. And it was a very poor article, in my judgment. We've dealt with these themes here very frequently before, with much greater depth. I said that Mephisto is a midrash on Goethe, and therefore I owe it to you to give you at least a brief outline of what the Goethe theme is. And since we have some distinguished professors of English literature in the congregation this morning, I expect to get more help in this area than I did from Martha Graham, or on Martha Graham. Okay, so if I get out of line, Rhoda, would you please help me out? Sartre's Flies, yes. There was a... there wasn't a Trojan Women done also? I mean, there are many examples. But right now, Rhoda, could you help me out on Goethe? Because I haven't read the play for a long, long time, and I thought that it would be appropriate not to bone up on it. It wouldn't be fair, because you're going to see the movie. As a matter of fact, if I were the man who made that movie, I'd feel very much about me the way I feel about most of you, that you come to synagogue without having prepared. That whoever goes to see that movie should read Faust before they go there, should acquaint themselves with the text. When you go to see Hamlet or Macbeth, you really ought to read the text before you go there. You can't expect, if a play is a really great play, you can't expect to get it immediately just like that. And this is a movie that one would have to see several times. I'm quite sure I haven't fathomed all that there is to fathom in this. But nevertheless, the immediate impact was overwhelming. One felt that one was in the presence of an outstanding human being. I'm talking about the man. I don't even know the name of the man, because obviously in this day and age, Madison Avenue, it's the name of the movie that is advertised in the papers, and the name is nowhere to be found. Not even the actors are named, except when you get the credits in the movie house. I'd like to read more and know more about it. No doubt Pauline Kael will refer to it very shortly, but she hasn't as yet. Faust is a man who has lived a life of study. He's read everything, he's studied everything, he's experienced everything, he's got the end of his life, and he somehow feels that he wants to do more. He wants to recapture something of his lost youth. And he makes a pact with Mephistopheles, who of course is the devil. He sells his soul in order to be able to experience life all over again with the knowledge that he has. This is how I read it. There's a French saying, si jeunesse savait, si vieillesse pouvait. If only young people knew how, and if only old people could. And that gets more painful as you get older. It seems to me that the Faust theme is based on that notion. What Faust was going to get from the devil was the youth and the vigor to do with himself what he would have done when he was 18 years old, but he didn't know how. And so this is a great thing. He sells his soul. And in the course of the book, of course, he comes across Margareta, who represents presumably all the young women he would have liked to have made out with, but unfortunately, of course, it comes to a sticky end, for Margareta at least. And at the end of the play, as far as I can remember, Faust endeavors to somehow become saved. There's a discussion as to whether he actually is saved or isn't saved. At the very end, he gets involved in reclaiming land from the sea. One might say from a reconstructionist point of view that Faust recognizes that he has only paid homage to the first part of Hillel's maxim, Em eina nili mili. He has been a very selfish person. He has only thought of himself, and somehow the tragedy of his life is that he has only thought in terms of the first person singular. And at the end of his life, he gets involved in communal projects to reclaim land so that it can be used for the purposes of the community. And at the very end, he hears the people digging, and he thinks they are working on the dike. Actually, they are digging his grave. And so the question of whether, does he really get saved at the end, Rhoda? Can you help me out here? Is Faust? He is saved at the end, because you hear heavenly voices. But
Forecast at the end of part one, when the voices come down and hear someone, when the wretched flies up, and someone says, called out, redeemed. And the second half is this course for redemption.
But in fact, he does spend the last part of his life in communal works. And when he hears the digging in the ground, it is his grave and not the work. He confuses it. He doesn't realize it's coming. Thank you. This is the kind of a play where there are things, quotations that stick in your mind long after you've read it. One perhaps very relevant for a Reconstructionist congregation is a marvelous quotation which I used to know in German, which begins, Grau alle Theorie. Can anybody end that one for me, please? Yeah, I know what it means in English. It means theory is gray, action is green. Quite accidentally, I have another quotation here from somebody called Henry Green, but I'm sure the name happens to be accidental. It's been stuck in my sermon book for many, many moons now. Henry Green said, and I don't even know who Henry Green is, if you want to create life, the one way not to set about it is by explanation. If you want to create life, the one way not to set about it is by explanation. I sometimes wish that Rabbi Kaplan had not written a book called Questions Jews Ask, but Things Jews Do. And this notion that somehow talking about gets us nowhere, but action is important, is also echoed in another important part of the play, where Goethe, the Faust rather, is reading the Bible and comes across the sentence from the Gospel according to St. John, in the beginning was the Word. He muses about this for a while. In Anfang war das Wort. And then finally comes to the conclusion, this is wrong. That im Anfang, in the beginning, was die Tat. The action. Action is the beginning. In other words, it's a very existentialist notion, by the way. The idea that existence is prior to essence, that instead of talking and explaining what we think we are doing, or what we ought to be doing, or why we are not doing what other people are doing, we just go ahead and do it. And people learn more by observing people doing things than all the arguments and questions and answers and dialogue and discussion in the world. Another, yeah, I thought you'd come up with that one. Do you want to translate it? Yes, the eternal woman. Well, it's a matter of discussion. Yes? The eternal feminine. All right, we'll have a fight about that at Kiddush. He does have another quotation, by the way, about the mothers. Why is it I always have difficulties when I hear that word, the mothers? Do you remember where that comes? That's another thing he says. Why is it that people always have problems when people start talking about the mothers? So it's not a simple one-sided thing. The other, of course, is that when Faust is promising the devil that he will abide by the contract and signing his life away and never look backwards, will never tell the devil to stop, but will simply enjoy life. And there's that marvelous phrase where he says, I promise that I will never say to the fleeting moment, verweile doch, du bist so schön. Stop a moment. You are so lovely. He says, I'll be sold to this life of pleasure. I'll never stop. It just be going on and on. I sign on the line and will go on endlessly. And there are other very beautiful episodes, one particularly which is central to the movie, in which Faust, having made his contract with the devil, he's a college teacher. I'm not quite sure what that has to say about college professors. Decides he'd like to go out for a walk, and they joke about it a bit, and Mephistopheles decides to dress up as Faust, puts on his academic robe and hat, and an unsuspecting young student comes in to discuss prospects for studying at this particular college. And Mephistopheles has a field day teasing the student about what learning is all about and what learning is really about and what the most important things in life are and how he should get an agenda with top priorities. Of course, women come on the top of the agenda, and Mephistopheles has a field day. Rhoda, can you add? Do you remember that episode in the play where Faust goes out? The devil dresses in Faust's robes, and the student comes in without knowing that he's talking to the devil and not talking to the professor or the teacher. I never understood the meaning of that. That's why I say that the movie is a commentary on it. What is the movie about? I say it is a movie about the Holocaust, and yet it is not a movie about the Holocaust. You will not see a single concentration camp. You will see one Jew being beaten up. You will see one man being shot to death. But there is no attempt made, as there is in so many movies about the Holocaust, to teach about the Holocaust by showing the Holocaust. George Steiner used to argue that there was no way in which to portray the Holocaust in any kind of artistic form. Somehow, in the Holocaust, human experience had gone beyond the parameters which are available to the artistic creative mind, and that all that we can do about the Holocaust is be silent about it. But that was before George Steiner published a novel in which Hitler is found somewhere in Brazil and is brought back and is allowed to give a speech at his trial in which he accuses the Jews of having given him his main ideas about purity of race. I haven't read the novel yet. I understand in London, where it was a play, it was booed towards the end of the play, and any play which was booed is something that's going to be top of my list as soon as it comes to New York. I have a great affinity and sympathy with anything that's written or spoken that is booed. However, this tackles the Holocaust while not tackling the Holocaust. It's curious that one of the central figures is a black woman, and the issue of Jewish pain is expressed through the pain of a black woman who has to leave Germany and her German lover because she is not racially pure. It's a stroke of genius. We always assume that these issues have to be raised through Jewish eyes. In the New York Times a few days ago, there was a sad article by Russell Baker describing how near Washington, D.C. there is a school that refuses to teach Huckleberry Finn to students because there are derogatory words to black students used in that book. And I couldn't help thinking of all the years I agonized in English private schools. We call them public schools over there, which of course is the correct name for them. Whenever the one sole play which was taught year in, year out of Shakespeare, the one play which you'd think that Shakespeare had never written anything in the whole world other than The Merchant of Venice. And that was the sole play that was taught each year. So I have some sympathy with the students in Washington, D.C. who have to read Huckleberry Finn, in which there are derogatory references to black people. But they aren't the only people who have to live through this sort of thing. And somehow, every time we hear the St. Matthew Passion or read the New Testament, we have the same problem. And ultimately, it seems that unless we're prepared to Bowdlerize everything that has ever been written, and to have a clinical and antiseptic man, woman, and poem and play, we're simply not going to be able to have any kind of education, shut everything down while we're busily trying to protect ourselves from stereotypes. I often wonder what Japanese people feel about the late movies, and even the Germans after all this time, to see themselves caricatured on the movies that still come over time and again, portraying all Germans as Nazi bastards, all Japanese as slit-eyed, cruel, Machiavellian, megalomaniacal devils. We're all full of these stereotypes, and it seems to me to be a human being in the world today, all of us are going to have to give a little bit and tolerate a little bit. I'm glad that Polish jokes are now changing their ethnic origin. I'm not quite sure whether the arrow will fall next. At any rate, the movie is about an actor who at the beginning of the play is totally disinterested in politics. In fact, at the very beginning of the movie, when the issue of politics is raised, he disparagingly criticizes one of his peer actors about being involved in socialist democracy, the Nazi movement, the National Socialist movement, says, I'm not interested in those idiots, those fools, and there's a great deal of tension between this actor who's totally disinterested in politics and the other actor who feels that Nazism has something to offer. This is before Hitler comes to power. There were people who believed that Hitler had something to offer Germany before Hitler came to power. This actor who is derogatory about the young man who thinks that Nazism has something idealistic to offer wants to make it big on the stage. And it's obvious that on one level he is Faust selling his soul to the devil, because when you see him in the movie getting a contract in Berlin, he signs the document which literally makes it possible for the director to do everything to him, including him sweep the floors of the stage, any kind of part, any kind of role. He is so anxious to aim for glory and honor on the stage that he sells his soul away. He signs both documents, the top copy and the bottom copy, without even so much as reading them. He sells his soul. And of course, finally, Hitler comes to power, and all this is done with enormous delicacy, indirectly. You see hardly any of the actual brutality of what the Nazis do. You hear Hitler's voice. You see just the margin of what is going on. And finally, in the process of time, he becomes a very famous actor, and slowly he is sucked in to the Nazi propaganda machine. Who was the German Prime Minister who said, "Whenever I hear culture, I reach for my revolver"? Oh, I can see you're as well up in German history as I am. Was it not Goebbels who said that? I think it was Goebbels. At any rate, one of these Nazi leaders is portrayed in the movie and recognizes in our so-called hero, especially when he performs as Mephistopheles in a performance of Goethe's Faust, that he is eminently suited to preach the Nazi gospel to the world. And they send him abroad. They send him to Paris, and he gives speeches trying to show that Nazism is simply a movement which endeavors to restore national self-esteem and pride to the German people, and that some unpleasant things may be happening in the process of Nazism affirming itself, but that these are peripheral and marginal next to the central dream of the German people becoming its own master again, having only German heroes, having only German art, having only German culture, having only German poetry, having only German actors. It's a beautiful scene where a discussion takes place in an art gallery, where some ghastly modern German art which honors the German soldier, the new, proud, strong He-Man who is going to destroy the world. And there's great talk of cultural Bolshevism, which means any kind of art and literature which does not support the doctrinaire approach to life of the Nazis. There is much more that could be said about the movie. I just want to elicit from it one central theme, which is the theme that I got. The curious phenomenon is these two personalities, the actor who sells his soul to get to Berlin and who becomes an important part of the Nazi movement, and the other actor who begins out as a supporter of National Socialism but ends by trying to get people to rally against it and is shot for his efforts. It's a curious study. That is to say, the actor who in the beginning is totally disinterested in Nazism ends up by being one of the greatest Nazis of them all, the quintessential Mephistopheles. The other who begins toying with Nazism as a possible way of restoring German pride realizes as soon as Hitler is elected and watches what is done by Hitler and in the name of Nazism, that it is an evil movement, tries to destroy it, is too late. His name is actually given to the authorities by our friend, the hero, the one who plays Mephistopheles. Before he is shot to death, there is a brief dialogue, the dialogue that I referred to before from Faust, where the devil dresses up as Faust and the young student comes in. The poor fellow who's going to get shot in a few minutes' time plays the role of the student. And Mephistopheles, as Faust, they're not in costume, it's a non-costume rehearsal, having this dialogue between them. about what is and what is not important in life suddenly made me realize for the first time what Goethe's Faust is really about, and what it meant in Goethe's Faust when Faust steps outside and allows the devil to dress up in his clothes. It is obvious to me, even if it was not obvious to Goethe, that Mephistopheles and Faust are one and the same. And they are both Goethe. That is to say that the two sides of the human personality, it is there in the original play, it's almost made painfully clear in the film, because of the way in which the movie works out, that what both Goethe and Mephisto, the movie, are telling us is that there is no hard and fast distinction between the devil and God. That insofar as human beings are concerned, each one of us contains within ourselves a little bit of Mephistopheles, and each one of us contains within ourselves a piece of Faust, and that we need our families and our societies to prevent an imbalance in the ratio between the two. There is no such thing as any human being, man or woman, who does not have within him the seeds of Mephistopheles and Hitler, the seeds of the good, saintly person who wants to do good for his fellow human beings in noble communal works. What happens in the movie, and it's portrayed so brilliantly that it's almost breathtaking, is that this German leader, Goering or Goebbels or Ribbentrop, whoever he is able to see how in a human being who wants to sell out, who wants glory and pride and honor, and is prepared to sacrifice anybody in the process, his wife, his loved ones, his best friends, that the diabolical can transcend the divine. And that the need that the Nazis had for this kind of person was that he answered to the needs of the negative side of Nazism. The sadness is also, on the other side, that even in Nazism, originally, there was some good. The young man who, before Hitler comes to power, is busy teaching young Nazi youths how to exercise and how to shout the Nazi slogans, really is not a wicked person. He really believes that the slogans the Nazis are coming out with have some spiritual meaning. He believes that German culture has been destroyed by foreign imports. He believes that the German people are overwhelmed by foreigners. He believes that the German people must have dignity, that they cannot live a creative, meaningful peoplehood life if they have foreigners living in their midst, that they need to have a Germany that is free of all non-Germans, all foreigners, all black people, all people who do not share German values. He sees that there is ideological propensity in this movement. It is only when he watches the concentration camps, it is only when he hears Hitler's hysterical, insane voice that he realizes that the insanity is greater than the idealism. And at that point, it is too late. So the movie is a study in selling out, and the movie is also a study in helping organizations, ideologies, and issues which we have strong reservations about, but which we feel we have no alternatives in supporting. Here we have the incredible problem, a young Nazi who is an idealist, who believes that Nazism can save German society, who realizes ultimately that it can't and loses his life in the process, an actor whose only desire is to be an actor, to be in the limelight, to be the center of attraction, who is totally indifferent to political values, but will use them if he can climb on the back of the likes of Hitler and Ribbentrop and Goebbels and become somebody who gets all the applause and the acclaim. And even he, even the one who sells out, is not completely bereft of values. The movie focuses on how he tries to help stagehands who are racially impure stay on their jobs, how he will even go to the leadership of the Nazi movement to plead and to intercede on behalf of friends, and how he rationalizes himself. Yes, I am a Nazi. Yes, I am selling Nazism to the world. Yes, I know Hitler is doing many bad things, but by remaining within the Nazi movement, I can help to make certain good things happen which would not happen otherwise. How easily one can become a prostitute without knowing it, justifying oneself that one is serving good purposes all the way along. There is nothing simple about this movie, and there is nothing simple about life. I draw attention to this movie without any further commentary in a week in which Jews are asked to stand up and be numbered on behalf of the state of Israel in commemoration of the dead of the wars of liberation, when Jews are being asked to stand up and be numbered on behalf of Russian Jewry, and a week in which we saw on television the tragic sight of Jews fighting Jews in the Sinai over the relinquishing of a settlement, the ultimate end of which hopefully is a more enduring peace in the Middle East. My concern in raising these issues today is that the impact that that movie had on me was not an impact which made me reconsider my attitude to the Holocaust. It was not a movie which made me reconsider my attitude towards UJN Federation. It was not a movie which made me reconsider my attitude towards Zionism. It was a movie which made me reconsider my attitude in my everyday life, beginning in my family and here. Who is selling out right now? Not complaining about who sold out then. There's an industry in American Jewish life today in arguing who sold out worse during the Second World War. Was it this one or that one? Was it Roosevelt? Every other day another book comes out in which somebody else is bad-mouthed for not having done more about what happened then. I am very interested in knowledge. I am very interested in reassessing what happened 30, 40, 50 years ago. It seems to me that if ever there was a way of getting off the hook, if ever there was a way of avoiding the central issue of who is selling out now, it's having more Holocaust days to commemorate the past. I am not saying we shouldn't have Holocaust days, but what I would like to suggest is we have selling out days, that we have sit-in seminars from time to time, when we all come and sit round the table and say to ourselves, are we selling out? We don't know when we're selling out. If anything this movie did was to indicate that the guy who's selling out never knows that he's selling out. It's always the other guy who knows that you're selling out. You don't know you're selling out because you think you're doing something very moral. You say, well, yes, I am involved in certain kinds of ideologies and organizations and things and actions and behaviors where a lot of bad things are being done. Yes, I know we do this and that and the other. However, how worse would it be if I were not here? The movie called Mephisto puts paid to that argument for a long time. It's the cheapest sort of argument to say, well, I'm helping a bad system go round. I give a little bit of charity here and there. I helped this lame dog over a stile, and only last week a blind lady was helped over Broadway by me. How can you accuse me of supporting tyrannous regimes, pathological ideologies? I'm a good man, I am. Don't go and see the movie if that's your rationalization for living. The movie raises a question right now. It tells us about something that happened, but it tells us, like all great art does, in terms of here and now. What are we doing now? What are the areas of our lives where we are turning the other way because we don't want to be emotionally engaged in what we really know we ought to be doing something about? The question of the bomb, for example. It's table talk. We vie with each other as to who read the New Yorker articles first. But who is really doing anything positive? And there are 1,000,001 ways of doing something positive. Sometimes I think that all the marches that we did in the 60s was a desperate kind of a way to assuage the guilt that while millions were perishing at Auschwitz, we were worrying about shaping the head of the bar mitzvah boy in chopped liver for our bar mitzvah parties. That somehow we felt that we were caught short during the Holocaust, and that never again would we ever be accused of lying down. And the most obvious and the simplest thing very often to do is to march. You feel virtuous when it's all over. It's like jogging. You march. Above all, people see you. Oh, they say, Moshe Chaim, a very fine person. Did you see he marched with his wife and children? The trouble with marching is it's something that just takes place on a Sunday in April, and it's all over, unless there's a follow-up. And the follow-up is painful. It means time, it means money, it means commitment, and if it's something that we can't do ourselves, it means at least being aligned and committed to organizations which are trying to do something about it. We have membership meetings at the SAJ from time to time, and we all want to get people to become members. So under the beneficent benediction of Jack Levithan's presence, we always are nice and we never pull the punches. But when people sit round in 1982 and tell me that they are thinking about having a commitment to belonging to a synagogue, I say, you're thinking about it. Why the hell aren't you in a synagogue? Where else should you be? The one thing that a synagogue does is to at least generate a certain amount of energy so that a letter or a check which is sent to an organization in the name of a synagogue and on your behalves. I am a member of dozens of organizations about which we cannot do anything as a congregation because we don't have the manpower and the people, but at least we are modestly involved, and that probably is selling out too. How can any Jew not be involved in some kind of communal Jewish life today? How can any Jew not be a member of this or that or the other, whether it's a synagogue or the American Jewish Committee or the American Jewish Congress or B'nai B'rith? How long can Jews sit on the fence in the 20th century and say, well, yes, it's very interesting. I do read the Jewish newspapers, and I always read Anthony Lewis and William Safire. I've got a Jewish heart. So what? If anything sells out more, it's those cardiac Jews. We don't need cardiac Jews. We do need 12 donors, by the way, who have good blood. We don't need metaphorical cardiac Jews. I accuse myself more than I accuse you of selling out. Being a rabbi in this day and age, one has to be very careful to tread a very delicate line between making sure that the deficit is balanced, the budget is balanced, and dealing with the kind of issues that Jews, many Jews, do not want to hear about when they come to synagogue. I wish I had the talent of the man or woman who made Mephisto, to be able to couch issues over here in terms of issues over there, that people who leave the synagogue might feel as uncomfortable and as challenged and as threatened as I did when I left that movie house this week, having seen a movie which made me feel totally uncomfortable with my present moral posture, and a desire to reevaluate where I stand, in spite of all the reasons why one shouldn't over-challenge people who delicately, with great anxiety, step in from outside and begin to think of contemplating joining a synagogue. How soft the cell must be, how careful, how apologetic we must be, how happy everybody has to be, how nobody must be ruffled, how nobody must be unhappy, how unhappy the leaders of the community get if anybody doesn't walk away on a Sabbath morning feeling that the world is a beautiful place and that every day and in every way the world in which we live is getting better and better. It's not. We live in a very sick world. And insofar as the synagogue ignores the pathology of our world, we as Jews are selling out. And every time we look the other way when certain things happen in the Jewish community in Israel, which we don't want to talk about. Perhaps I sold out this week when a young man from a radio station called me and asked me if I had any views about whether the Israelis should move out of Yamit or not. And I refused to talk. And perhaps I sold out. I refuse to talk because I will not talk about what people have to do 5,000 miles away. I want to talk about what you can do, because we're all here together on West 86th Street. The Israelis are going to have to solve their own problems. We're going to have to solve our problems. These are issues. Constantly had the feeling that many Jews would much rather solve the moral problems of Jews in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv because it gets them off the hook from solving the problems of the South Bronx and the Upper West Side. We Jews live in America. If we are going to continue to live in America, America's problems are our problems. If you are very much concerned about what is happening in Israel, what the Israelis and Mr. Begin really want of you is to buy a one-way ticket to Ben Gurion Airport and stay there and face the music. They don't want cheap advice from Jews living off the fat of the land up the Upper West Side. We have serious problems in our midst, in our community. And all of us should go and see that movie and ask ourselves the question that I am asking myself today and sharing with you. Am I selling out? I've asked a very simple question today. I want 12 people to help give blood between the ages of 18 and 60. I'm very curious to know whether by 9 o'clock on Monday morning we have 20 volunteers or no volunteers. It's not a pleasant thing to do. I want you to know I'm very uncomfortable. I thought when I volunteered, when I went to visit the lady in the hospital, I opened my big mouth. She says, "Rabbi, I want blood." I said, "Come on, both arms." I thought it was like going to the Red Cross and getting some candy and a cup of coffee. Well, it isn't, apparently. You have to fit into some machine. I don't like machines. I'm going to do it. I think I'm developing a sore throat so I can put it off for a week. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. We're asking you, somebody's dying and they need your blood. I'm interested. How many people will volunteer? How many people will call Jim? By the way, you don't have to be a member of the congregation. We'll accept your post-dated check. I don't want to do it. I really don't. I resent people using my blood. It's enough that rabbis have to give their blood to the congregation metaphorically, without having to feel every time I visit somebody who's dying, I'm going to give real blood. It's a challenge. I'm sharing my anxieties with you. And there are other issues. We are called on not just to do what comes out of petty cash, and I mean that literally and metaphorically, not the things that come easily to us, the things that hurt a bit. This synagogue is blessed. In there we have a large number of people, larger than I think many congregations, who are actively involved in the survival of the synagogue. We still do not have a social action committee, and try as I may, I'm not able to prevail upon the leadership of the community to create a social action committee. A social action committee which would focus exclusively on issues of selling out. A social action committee which would be an ongoing colloquium of tried and tested members of the synagogue, which would constantly deal with issues of whether we are selling out. Is anybody listening to me out there? I constantly ask the question. There are some people in this room who a year ago in this hall, when somebody spoke, I've forgotten what the topic was. What was the topic? No, was it South Africa? Was it South Africa? I thought it was the Timmerman issue. I thought it was Argentina or Nicaragua, whatever it was. It was Argentina. We had a young actor. We had a young actor from Argentina who was trying to do what the actor that Mephisto is about didn't do. He was trying to make us aware that as Jews we had an absolute moral obligation to become more involved. Without a group of people, the rabbi can't do it because I'm as mortal and as frail and as cowardly, and I try to sell out as much as you do. I need a watchdog, a moral watchdog committee. It should be a cross-section of the congregation. Every profession should be represented on it. Every profession, every age group should be represented on it. It should meet perhaps once a month. And every time it meets, it should discuss whether, within the given limitations of the kind of congregation that we are, our need to survive without splitting the congregation from top to bottom through the kind of issues that will divide us from top to bottom, our fiscal needs, our responsibilities to the Jewish people and to the American people, whether we are not dragging our legs in certain respects, whether we could do even a little more than we are doing in terms of the moral challenge that came to me on 3rd Avenue and 60th Street this week. I am not going to raise the issue of a social action committee with the leadership of the synagogue anymore. I have raised it once too often. I'm tired of being a pain in the neck. I am asking members of the congregation and the Board of Trustees who are here today to hear what I'm saying. We need a group of people who are not involved with fundraising, who are not involved with adult Jewish education, who are not involved with running the school, who are not involved with sitting on the Board of Trustees, but are only and exclusively involved in monitoring the congregation and the world and trying to find some razor's edge where we could do a little more about the moral realities of life than we are doing already. You know, I think I'd like to devote the next 7 minutes to a discussion of that very topic, because I don't know whether some of you may not want to tell me right now that I'm asking for the moon, and in which case please do. Carol, please, would you please stand up so that people can hear what you're saying?
I'm confused to exactly what we're selling out about. Could you give us a couple
Yes. Each year, when issues such as Yom Shoah crop up, and Russian Jewry crops up, and the celebrations for Israel crop up, we somehow always at the last minute try to arrange things so that, for example, tomorrow, this weekend, when the Reconstructionist Kala is meeting, it coincides with the day that is set apart for the March on Russian Jewry. So, and I am teaching a bar mitzvah class at 12 o'clock, when everybody else in New York who is interested in the Russian Jews are meeting to march. Last year, thanks largely and uniquely to Aaron Ziegelman and Lois, we had a group of people who met at Mel and Kayla Gluck's home. But it's the first time it's happened for years. Things don't happen unless people make them happen. We do not have a presence this year at the Russian Jewish Parade. That's enough for the time being. We also did not have a presence at Temple Emmanuel for the Yom Shoah celebrations. It's true that Rabbi Lewitas discussed the issue last week, but that's not what I'm talking about. Now, I'm not saying that we can do Yom Shoah and Russian Jewry and nuclear arms and Zionism and Federation and UJA. I'm perfectly prepared for some such committee to refer back to the Board of Trustees and say, look, we only have 350 families, and we can't afford to rock the boat. There are some people who don't like certain things, and if we start pushing for certain things, they're going to resign. And therefore, our best advice to the congregation is, if you want to support those things, support them as individuals. We can't support them as congregations. My feeling is there are certain issues which are supported much more vitally if we support them as congregations. Does anybody hear what I'm saying? I really would like some response from people here who are in a position to be able to... Pamela, would you respond to what I'm saying, please? Because otherwise, all we do is get up on Yom Kippur and piously celebrate Raoul Wallenberg, instead of asking ourselves whether we ought not to be trying to emulate Raoul Wallenberg now at this very moment. I'm talking about avoiding central issues. Yes, Diana. Could you talk louder, please? I don't know, Diana, because I think the 80s are not the 70s and they're not the 60s. Right now, thanks to Irene Hyman, the chairman of our Education Committee, and we've been badgering for this for a long time, we're finally, sometime at the end of this current year, we're going to have a debate in the synagogue about neoconservative Jews. We're going to have one of your commentary right-wing spokesmen, you know what I'm talking about, Norman Podhoretz type, Seymour Siegel from the Jewish Theological Seminary, no less. And we're going to try to find somebody on the other side, like Al Vorspan. We're not going to try to push one view as opposed to another view. I don't think synagogues can take political positions. But we've never even had the kind of debate that could enable people to hear the position on both sides. My ultimate goal is that this committee ultimately should try to push the educational dimension of these issues. Political action ultimately must be taken by individual members of the congregation. But we haven't even tackled these issues from an educational point of view. We haven't even had positions on both sides of the fence on these issues. Take the nuclear issue, for example. I'd be reluctant to have a program on Sunday night on the nuclear issue. I don't think we'll be able to wean our congregation away from Masterpiece Television. And frankly, if Brideshead Revisited was on, that would include me. Yes, Myron.
I find that I disagree with you very much in what you're...
About the committee?
Yes.
Right.
And unfortunately, I see, if you remember 17 years ago, I resigned from the congregation. I resigned from the congregation 17 years ago when I was much younger, 65, and I wrote you a letter that was very nasty. It was about the hypocrisy of the Social Action Committee in this congregation, which did absolutely nothing. And I was out on the streets marching. I was one of those people. And I think that the position I took then was absolutely wrong, that we should have had a Social Action Committee. I do not think so. I do not think the synagogue is the place to provide forums for discussing opposing views of nuclear armament or disarmament or whatever, or almost any of those kinds of issues in which there is a fair presentation of the issues and an educational purpose. I have a host of other places and media which will provide me with much, much better information and much, much better ways of going about changing what I think is maybe a policy I don't approve of. I don't understand the purpose of having 7 people, 10 people, a committee of the whole, whatever, to sit and look at whatever selling out may be, and I think that it will vary, of course, for 350 people, whoever's at the committee, it will be totally different. It has no meaning in those terms. I think what does have meaning here is to learn about what it means to be a Jew, how to behave as one, and so on. And those things are part of acting as an American citizen and so on. But the impetus to be direct and to give direction in terms of, this is what we believe in terms of nuclear armament. We would be here for the next 3 weeks discussing an issue that would have, based on ignorance. I would find myself talking in terms of ignorance. On Monday there will be a demonstration in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York. So, whoever goes, goes. And it's a movement that's very large in the United States now as well as in Europe. And I think that the discussing of it in the synagogue as an issue per se doesn't advance it in any way or retard it in any way, whichever way it may be. But I think that the learning of other things in terms of pointing out our own feelings, our approaches, and so on, that needle that you have given us over the years in many ways, both intellectually and emotionally, are much more important to me.
That needling, did you say needling, Myron? I thought I heard needling. That needling will not cease. But yes, and then Linda.
I have in my hand a brochure or an announcement reading, this is by 2, 4, 6, 8, 11 congregations. Invite your active participation in the first Jewish religious conference in New York on nuclear arms, Judaism, and the Jewish community at the Stephen Wise Synagogue tomorrow from 1 to 6.
I just made the announcement. You missed it. I made the announcement during the service. I just specifically announced that, unfortunately, because there was no way in which the SAJ could become involved because we have no vehicle whereby we could become party of that. The name of the SAJ is conspicuously absent from a list of some dozen synagogues, and I draw that to the congregation's attention. I am not authorized to tell Rabbi Brickner that the SAJ wishes to be publicly associated with a nuclear issue. There is no way in which the congregation right now, on a purely administrative basis, can become involved in these issues. The committee that used to perform this was the Social Action Committee, which had the blessing of the Board of Trustees. Linda?
As on many issues, I feel two ways. I feel ambivalent. I would say after 2 years of being on the executive committee of the synagogue, we are constantly faced with moral issues. There is no way of getting away from moral issues. Almost every issue that we or any other synagogue approaches has a moral direction to it, whether it's somebody's pension, somebody's salary, many different things. The one that comes immediately to my mind is last year we were thinking about having the second congregation Seder, as we usually do, and decided not to do it because it would mean that our Christian employees would have to wait on Easter. That was a moral issue. I don't think it's not as large a moral issue as nuclear arms or Soviet Jewry or whatever, but it's still a moral issue, and we face them continuously. I also feel many times when I read about Christian clergymen being involved in nuclear disarmament and things like that, I wonder why as many Jews are not. And I feel that that's something that should be discussed before we even get into it as a congregation. How involved do we want to be? Do we feel that this is something that Jews should be involved in as well?
Sisu?
We have to mention as our congregation, this was represented by Temple Manuel last Sunday. I do not recall once here you to give information how people can receive tickets from Baghdad. I happened to have a couple of tickets last Sunday. I made a few phone calls. I will not mention the names, and everyone has a different schedule to go. By the end, I took a neighbor, and the third person was a goy. And I went to Temple Emmanuel, and I went...
You mean a non-Jewish person, I presume?
Right.
Martha Graham.
I wanted to make the point that this lady did before.
Could you turn around and face the congregation and talk louder, because they can't hear you.
You did announce that there will be this meeting at Stephen Wise, but I'm sorry, I didn't hear you say 12 other congregations would be there. Did you say that?
No. No, I didn't. First of all, I don't know whether 12 congregations will be there. In the publicity material, there were 12 congregations listed. Yeah.
That's the point that lady made, and the point I was going to make before. What are other congregations doing with social action? And do they neglect the education of Jews along the lines of being Jewish, or do they add to the education?
Yeah, I don't think anything that I said this morning could be construed as neglecting Jewish education.
I don't think so either. I'm backing you.
That's all right. No, well, you don't have to back me. I just want to be quite clear that Marin's point is well made. The pulpit will not be used for political purposes. The pulpit will be used for Jewish education, as I hope I have been using the pulpit this morning, to draw attention to issues in connection with, or as I say, I don't usually deal with movies on a direct level. I suppose we could have managed to link the theme of Mephistopheles and Faust with the idea of leprosy, which is found in the Torah today, without too much effort, since the rabbis read the word Metzorah as Motzi Shem Ra. They believe there is a direct link between the way in which people lead their lives or govern their lives and the kind of plagues that descend upon them, but that I thought would have been too far-fetched. My purpose this morning was to raise some questions, and I hope that there will be some response. Pamela?
I've been thinking about this issue lately because I was visited a couple of weeks ago and asked the question. We periodically ask ourselves, what are we doing? Do we talk about issues of well, or reaching our heads in the reconstructionist business or the reconstructionist plan? I remember that social action committee years ago. It was largely conceptual, but they weren't really doing. I think the meeting pathetic in terms of. And what we've always decided when this issue has come up is that we can't really do anything. We're a very small congregation. We can't really have an effect on what's going on. But it still makes me uncomfortable. And that's why when you raised the issue this morning, I feel myself responding to it completely accurately. And I think the answer is that we should begin to do something, even if we don't know where it will lead us. So the people who do care should at least start.
Right. I want to conclude now. Okay, so I'm sorry. Sally?
Over the years that at least I have either been chairman of this community board or a member of this community board, the involvement of the local synagogues and churches has been interesting and has driven far greater involvement on the part of the Christian organized church community than the organized Jewish community. The only time over these past 10 years that at least I had any response from the organized Jewish community was in response to look inside of the street plot and we should not have it on Saturday. However, the issues of landmark designation of houses of worship has come home, and we have had an enormous amount of response recently because that does hit home. Here in this local community, on 70th Street, Spanish Portuguese wants to move a building, Second Church of Christ Scientist wants to take the building down, and so forth. That has finally brought some response from the religious community. However, over these same 10 years, as we all began to purchase cooperative apartments and so forth, all of the low-income people were displaced. We have a march tomorrow because the SRO, single room occupancy building, is being emptied out. One was emptied around the corner from here on 85th Street, where several people were killed by thugs sent by their landlord. It was very hard for me to get a group of people to stand up and say, let's help them, because most of them owned property on that block and really didn't want to participate. I'm not saying you have to do it, What I am saying is that that displacement is no different from the displacement we spoke of before.
Okay.
I would love the city
All
to
right.
be involved.
This all began because I saw a movie this week. I'm reminded of a phrase that comes to me from my high school days, from Virgil, I believe. Facilis descensus Averni. The road to hell is very easy. You slide there, and you're there before you know where you are. The movie was a study, was a commentary on that statement. That is to say, you saw somebody who was like anybody, interested in becoming an actor and doing his thing. He got sucked into a moral issue and ultimately ended up by becoming diabolical and helping and encouraging others to become diabolical. The issue that I present to you this morning, I don't want to be misunderstood. I am not saying that this pulpit should be used to any lesser extent than it has been in the past to inform Jews on Jewish issues. This is what this pulpit is for. Our Adult Education Committee is to sponsor issues like Passover workshops. I'll give you an example, to teach Jews how to conduct Seder service in their own home and to give them knowledge about the Jewish background, Jewish history, Jewish learning, to enable them to be better Jews through the cycle of the Jewish year, to become more involved. We have now an annual pilgrimage to Israel, which hopefully will teach people to learn more about Israel, to be more generous to the UJ contributions, and so on and so forth. There's one serious gap in this institution, and I think we're avoiding the issue by ignoring and distorting what I'm saying. The gap is that there is no committee that simply serves the purpose of drawing attention within the limits of the logistics of this congregation to certain issues, such as the nuclear issue, such as the abortion issue, such as the birth control issue, such as the housing issue, such as all these pressing issues which are issues right here where we live in our community. We're afraid because we think this is going to politicize the synagogue. The synagogue is not a political institution. The pulpit is not a political institution. And we are not asking members to take action because we would never get agreement from Jews. You know, 2 Jews, 3 synagogues, 4 opinions. This is the standard procedure. We don't expect to get unanimity on these issues. But there is surely a place in the congregation for education on the kind of moral issues which don't belong on the pulpit because they tend to deal with issues which do not directly relate to Judaism, but yet surely ought to be the concern of thinking Jews. You can't be Jewish without being concerned with these issues. How can we somehow, however modestly, introduce them to the congregation? Between the lines of what I'm hearing this morning, I hear people saying, it's not our problem as Jews to be concerned with these things, and that's what worries me. We have an obligation, even if we only do it in a way which is not perfect, even if we do it 50% perfectly, even if we only succeed in raising certain issues, even if we only succeed in drawing certain issues to people's attention. At least at the beginning, let it not be said that I failed to draw your attention to a blood-curdling movie called Mephisto, which is showing at 3rd and 60th Street, and I hope that some of you will reevaluate what you've heard me say this morning after you've seen the movie. We rise for our lane on page 194. Saturday, May the 1st, 1982, Achrei Mot Kedoshim. Mac Passerman was operated on this week and is recuperating very nicely. I'm not going to mention the name of the hospital because he's not well enough yet to receive direct calls, but I know that Miriam would welcome receiving a card or just some kind of acknowledgement that you wish him a very speedy recovery, as I do on this moment. So, those of you who know Mac Passerman, please don't contact the hospital directly, but please a telephone call to Miriam or a card to Mac, care of Miriam, we'll give you the address via the office, I know would be greatly appreciated. He's recuperating, doing very nicely, and I look forward to seeing him next week. I'd like to thank all those members of the congregation who provided home hospitality for our visiting high school students. We really appreciate your putting yourselves out and welcoming into your homes visitors from out of town. I'd also like to thank Sheila Bassman, who was acting as cantor this morning. Eliezer Kornreich caught the virus that I had last Saturday and which I still have today. Cantors can stay at home because the service can be sung, but today was an important occasion I did not want to miss, as indeed last week was an important occasion. So I feel I'm operating on 2.5 cylinders, so please, I would like your cooperation and moderate amount of sympathy. Not too much, God forbid, but just a little amount. Okay. And I'm sad on several accounts because I was hoping that my own SAJ high school students with whom I spend a great deal of time during the year discussing all kinds of different ideas would have been here this morning. I was hoping that somehow we'd be able to have a discussion and I'd be able to call on them because I know them personally. However, I'm sure it wasn't done deliberately. This high school weekend was arranged to take place coincidentally with the Saturday on which Jewish students and other students had to take their SATs. Can I ask a question? I mean, were we aware that that was the case, or did we just do it? We didn't know. We did know.
When the date was picked a year ago, no one knew. By the time we knew, it was...
Well,
There were no good alternatives.
all right. All right, I understand. This is just a voice in the wind, and I'm not putting any blame anywhere because I know how difficult it is. I myself find myself teaching a bar mitzvah class tomorrow when the Russian parade is beginning, and I'm continuing it because I think that we've lost so many teaching hours. The value of hanging around waiting for the march to start, I don't think is as valuable as having a continuation of the subject that we were discussing last week. So I'm putting Torah first. I'm a great believer that cloistered study also helps the Jews in Russia. But I hope that many of our members will try to attend that parade tomorrow. I'm saddened and I'm pained, but for almost historical reasons. And of course I'll tell you why. The whole Reconstructionist experience begins in precisely that kind of painful conflict which all of us know as children, as young people, between being Jewish and being American, or being Jewish and being English. Rabbi, oh, I beg your pardon. I told you I was working on 2.5 cylinders. Now, come on now. If I regress, you see, and assume that everybody's either Jewish or English, you'll understand. By the way, even though I don't recognize my own students, and of course at the SAJ anybody is encouraged to raise their hand and ask a question at any point in the sermon. And I hope that our visitors will utilize that availability. I don't like people making noises while I'm making noise, but I would very much appreciate if you have if I say anything that you'd like me to clarify further, please do, especially our visitors I'm addressing this to, raise your hands and let me try to explain it. Every group begins with a founding myth, and sometimes there's truth in the myth, and sometimes there isn't truth in the myth, but a well-known Reconstructionist myth, which also has truth in it, is the story that Rabbi Kaplan tells when he first came to America. I understand from Michael Wolff that the theme of this weekend is the immigrant experience. And of course, I think I'm right in saying that 2 of the rabbis of the SAJ had been themselves immigrants. Rabbi Kaplan himself was an immigrant, and of course, as our young friend from Montreal picked up very sharply, I also was an immigrant. Rabbi Kaplan was in Europe. His father came over to serve as a rabbi in New York, I believe as what's called an assessor, a dayan of the Beit Din, leaving Mrs. Kaplan, Mordecai Kaplan's mother, and Mordecai behind, and I presume the other children were with them at the same time. They came over much later when Mordecai was a young boy on a French ship on the 14th of July. And it was Friday afternoon, and the fireworks were just about to go off, and Mordecai's mother said that he had to go downstairs into steerage and say the afternoon and the evening prayers. By the time I got back on deck, remembers the young Mordecai, the fireworks were over. That is when I realized that living in 2 civilizations was going to be a problem. It seems, plus ça change, we've got ourselves into exactly the same situation again. We have a Reconstructionist gathering in New York City, the first time we've ever had so many young Reconstructionists from abroad. Abroad, you see, there we go again. Anything outside Manhattan is abroad. And they're taking SATs, all right? And even those, I understand, who got letters from their rabbis saying so-and-so cannot take his SATs on Saturday for religious reasons and is taking them on Sunday, which you can do, are not in synagogue this morning. You're busily boning up for another 24 hours to get an advantage over those who are taking their SATs today. By the way, I should have added when I was thanking Sheila for standing in for Cantor Kornreich, who has a very bad cold. One of the Baalei Kriya, I will not mention who, said I should apologize on their behalf for any mistakes that may have been made because they were only called upon to do the Kriyat HaTorah at the last minute. Of course, we don't accept some such arguments usually. However, I would draw our visiting Reconstructionists to a very central and important part of the way in which we implement Reconstructionism here at the SAJ, and that is that we try to make it as non-professional a procedure as possible. That is to say, what you saw this morning was not simply a special show put on for visitors, but something which is a regular occurrence whereby members of the congregation conduct the service, read from the Torah, and of course chant the Haftarah. The strength and weakness of the Reconstructionist congregations is measured by the extent to which they themselves can become involved in this kind of creative support of traditional Jewish values and traditional modes. It seems to me that one of the biggest problems that we face in Reconstructionism today is understanding precisely the background from which Rabbi Kaplan came and in response to which Reconstructionism was created and the challenge that has to us. By the way, Montreal, even in England, the problem of living in two civilizations was heavy. And I well remember my own embarrassment in the third year at Oxford when I realized that examinations, final examinations, would be set on Saturday. Students of history may be interested to follow the emancipation of the Jew in England, the removal of all disabilities. I'm not suggesting we remove all disabilities, but I can't compete with Gabriel Isaac. Come back when you're a bit bigger and I'll take you on. At any rate, one could not repeat the examination on the Sunday because one might have had some kind of contact between people who had taken the examination, and that would have given the Jews an unfair edge, which they were believed to have anyway, if you've seen the Chariots of Fire. So one had to be cloistered in the house of one of the examiners chosen by the university from before sundown Friday night, and live under his constant surveillance until Sunday morning when he took you to a special college for the lepers who took their examination on Sunday morning. It was a terribly uncomfortable experience. You ended up taking the same examination that the other students took on Saturday, but you felt like an absolute pariah, and in addition, since my religious beliefs at that time were somewhat flaky, and that I had no real ritual objection to writing on the Sabbath, it became a matter of principle. You see, it's a strange kind of an argument. I remember we had a member of the congregation who ate non-kosher food in general, but when he traveled by aeroplanes, he always insisted on a kosher meal. And I said to him, why do you do that? He says, I don't eat kosher, but I believe in making the skies safe for people who do eat kosher. You don't like that logic? I'd like a react. You don't like that logic?
It's very standard. It's like the argument that we heard when we were children. We don't care whether you believe in God, whether you don't believe in God. When it comes to high holidays, you're going to take off because we fought hard for the right for you to take off for the high holidays.
Did you hear that?
And don't endanger somebody else's right.
Did you hear that? It's a very delicate thing, and I myself feel very strongly that there is no hypocrisy involved in this whatsoever. I think that certain things which Jews fought for, certain disabilities which Jews fought, the right to do certain things. I don't know whether all of the things that Jews fight for are necessarily valid to fight for. I mean, sometimes one reads in the newspapers, one did this week, that some soldier down in Texas wore a right to go on duty in the guardhouse wearing talis and tefillin or something like that. I mean, it seems to me that's or a yarmulke. I mean, it seems to me that on some level, but the Jack, you have a comment.
It was an Air Force captain asking for the right to wear a yarmulke, and he said that in no way this interfered with discipline in the Air Force. So I think you overstated the case grossly, make it the feeling, and said this in the whole thing, because it's hard. They said it was discipline and safety, and I think it was a typical irrational military mind.
All right. Well, the military mind is not completely irrational. I remember when I was an army chaplain in England, There was a young officer in training who was on basic training from which there was no way out. I mean, it was like trying to get out of hell. I mean, once you were on that program, you were in. And Pesach came right in the middle. And this young man was faced with tremendous obligation. He was an authentic, sincere Orthodox Jew and had to be in basic training for Pesach. Ultimately, I managed to persuade the British Army to provide him with completely brand new utensils, meat and milk, and the food was brought in from outside with the wine and the matzah. It was a fairly solitary event because he was stationed somewhere in the wilds, but the principle was established, and this young man maintained his status. He became an officer, served throughout his army stint. I was his chaplain throughout that entire period, and remained a completely Orthodox Jew for the entire period of the procedure. I don't know whether any of you have stories of a like quality, but it is a problem. And this clash between SATs and Shabbat is just one of many examples whereby that, I call this the Kaplan myth, although I understand it actually happened, hasn't really changed in the 50, 60, 70 years. It's still difficult to live in two civilizations, even in New York City, which perhaps outside of Israel is possibly the easiest place to live in two civilizations. I think I'd like to have some response to this statement because some of you are nodding your heads positively and some of you are shaking your heads negatively. Sandy? Go, Media, Pennsylvania. Let's have a response. Could you stand when you speak? I think people will find it easier to follow.
Walking to synagogue from 101st Street.
Yes.
You would think everyone in New York is either Jewish or a jogger.
What makes you think the joggers aren't Jewish? It's just a different kind of religion. I mean, you know, when you're a kid, you have to get up early. Your father asks you to wear tefillin. And when you get older, you don't wear tefillin, but you still have to suffer in the morning, so you jog instead. 99% of those joggers are atheistic Jews who still feel the need to suffer in the morning before they have breakfast. Whichever way they do it. I mean, I know two different families. One is a family which is a non-Orthodox home, and the child is rebelling by refusing to eat food in the parents' home because the parents' home isn't kosher enough. The other home is a home where the family is 100% kosher and the child is refusing to eat in the home. The reason the child is refusing to eat in the home is because she is a believer in organic food and the parents don't believe in organic food. And therefore, since she will only eat organic cheese and organic eggs and organic bread and organic rice and organic everything else, as far as she is concerned, that Orthodox home is as straight for her as the non-kosher home is straight for the Orthodox Jew. You can't win. Either way, they've got you, coming and going. It's a curious logic. In other words, in that family, regardless of what state of observance the family is at, children never eat in their parents' home. That's one way in which and there's always a reason why you don't eat. It's either kosher, or it's not organic, or some other fad will come up in years to come. The essential thing is that one rebels. And I suppose basically that's what the heart of the message I want to share with you this morning is, because one way and another I feel that we at the SAJ are moving into what I call a second stage of Reconstructionism, which is hardly to be expected since the basic ideas of Rabbi Kaplan were formulated by the end of the 30s in precise detail, and there hasn't been very much change in those ideas since that time. And it's not that the ideas are changing so much today, because of course the corpus of Kaplan's writings remain, but that the way in which we believe the Reconstructionist way of being Jewish can best be approached or best be lived is the area in which differences take place. And one of the most signal differences, of course, in this place that you wouldn't have seen 10 years ago or even 5 years ago is the presence of a traditional prayer book. A lot of very important things have happened in this, actually in this room. This was the room where Rabbi Kaplan used to hold forth week after week on his idea of God. We didn't understand it then, and we don't understand it now. But that's what went on in this room week after week on the high holy days. Some of us here remember those sermons. Rabbi Kaplan is, of course, alive very much still, but he's not giving any more sermons right now. At least to Rivka maybe, but not to anybody else. And In this room, it's just two brownstones knocked into one, as you'll know when you go upstairs. Walk very carefully, please. Things tend to fall from the floor if you don't. Was the first bat mitzvah of Judith Eisenstein. In this room, in this hall, in this auditorium, Rabbi Kaplan functioned, Rabbi Eisenstein functioned, Rabbi Jack Cohen, who is now Hillel Director in Jerusalem, functioned. Lots of important meetings took place, lots of important decisions were made, lots of people were bat mitzvah, so it has a great deal of significance on that level. What are the implications, the symbolic implications of a traditional prayer book in the synagogue? It's not that we've become orthodox, but that in two very important areas we've given ourselves a great deal of latitude in differing with the founder of Reconstructionism. And one of them relates precisely to this point of adolescent rebellion against parents. It seems to me that it's important for that rebellion to take place. It seems to me that it's important for both parents and growing young men and women to realize that the old and the new cannot be totally reconciled, and in every generation, men and women have got to learn how to become themselves, autonomous, individual, and separate. And this causes pain, and this causes suffering. No parents, no matter what they say and what they pretend, enjoy going through this experience. It is perhaps one of the most painful experiences that parents ever endure. As I see the young parents of this congregation bringing their children lovingly to synagogue, I cannot help thinking of the next 20 years and how those lovely little bundles of love, which don't answer back and simply respond to all the good things we do to them, are going to stand on their feet and tell us all to drop dead and go to hell, which is the normal way of things. It should be that way, but when it happens, mothers and fathers feel terribly resentful, and their first reaction is, after all I did for you, let me tell you, my dear friends, don't expect any returns in this business of child raising. There are no returns. The best return that you will have is if you live long enough, of course that's always an if, when your children have their problems with their children, they'll begin to look at you with a different light, and you may get a little bit of respect before they put you in a box and dig you 6 feet down. But don't rely on that. The fact of the matter is that the saddest tragedy on the part of parents is that after all that love and all that investment and all that caring and all that concern, as if the whole world revolved around that little bundle of love, and as if everybody should stop in the street and worship and adore at the sanctuary, the altar on which my child, the center of the universe, is placed. That gradually has to be reconciled with the need of the burgeoning child to become his or her own person. And that means having their own views. And sometimes it's important to have your own views, even if you agree with your parents. You can't agree, you've got to disagree. So you'll find a way of not eating at home. Whatever the grounds, whether it's kashrut or organic eggs, it makes no difference. And parents have got to try to see that children have a right to do that. Parents who themselves had enormous difficulty separating are the ones that make it hardest for children. They introduce subtle blackmail. They know how to pull strings. They know how to twist, how to ingratiate, how to give certain things in ways. It's very difficult when a child is being supported to be able to rebel and still be supported, to love and still to be rejected. Parents have great difficulties doing this. And of course, difficult it is on the part of the parents. It's even more difficult for the children. It's hard to say no. It's hard to go out and look. SATs, going to college, are very scary, frightening occasions. Some parents feel delighted because after a couple of weeks at college, the bold, roaring young adolescent who was saying for the last 3 years, I can't wait to get out of this rotten house, rings home in a state of total nervous breakdown, asking for love and nurture. And it's a very hard thing at that time for parents to be able to realize that the proper thing to do is to encourage the children to grow and grow away and grow separate, and not to feel proud because you can still control and they still need you. Of course they still need you. Children need you as long as you're alive. But there's a way of being available when they need you, and there's a way of trying to smother them and stifle them and strangulate them and control them. The issue ultimately is one of control. Control. And the subtle ways in which parents are able to control children are extraordinarily painful. And of course they're all rationalized. You're doing it for their own good. You're doing it for their own good. You're doing it because they don't know how to look after themselves yet. The most difficult thing is to stand and see children making mistakes, making errors, sometimes in choices of college, sometimes in choices of friend, sometimes even in choices of vocation, and to stand back and say, it's their right, let them do it. Remember what you did. Remember what we did. And if it's difficult for the parents, it's extremely difficult for the children. And this dialectic between the old and the new is a dialectic which does not only take place in the home, but which takes place everywhere. It takes place in offices, it takes place in academia, it takes place in colleges and universities, and of course it takes place in synagogue. In any given synagogue, at any given time, there's always tension between the people who've been there for a long time, the parents, and the people who've just joined, the children. The parents know how everything is run and assume automatically that the younger generation, the new intake, is going to follow quietly and obediently what's been done before. But that never works, because the same desire on the part of the young to break away from parents is a desire that carries throughout life. The need to be ourselves, not to always want to do things because the others did it before us that way. And so the tension between how much shall be repeated and how much should be changed and become original is at the heart of any organization. We see it in social work, we see it in psychoanalysis, we see it in the study of history, we see it in sociology, in every area where there are real, authentic human beings who went through their own growing pains in separating from their parents. You're going to have differences among colleagues, between heads of departments and junior staff, between head teachers and principals and faculty. I see Judith is giving a sly grin over there. And all this, is that a positive? Affectionate grin, yes. Very important to remain affectionate while it's all going on. All right. Now, what are the two areas where we feel, maybe I should say I feel, because the rabbi plays a central role, and of course, therefore, takes upon himself invariably, if he plays the role that he's supposed to play as a leader and not as a follower, as one who sets the tone and not one who merely, what is it, Paul? And it would have given me great pleasure today if we'd got a representative from each of our visiting groups to discuss the rabbis of the different congregations and how they handle it. I'd have loved that. Oh, I'd have loved that. We could have had a kind of a symposium on that topic, but it didn't seem fair. But I'll accept anonymous letters gratefully. We'll publish some of them in the bulletin. Of course, nowhere more than in the congregation does one get this youth versus age, or authority versus those who are supposed to accept authority. It's a very delicate topic, and the Reconstructionist movement as a whole hasn't even begun to tackle the question of authority. There's a great deal of confusion in Reconstructionism. And this, I think, also relates to a crucial point which Rabbi Kaplan demonstrates in his life, and I suppose to some extent I have to demonstrate in my own life. The word reconstruction means to do something about something that's already there. That is to say, Rabbi Kaplan came from Eastern Europe full of a very specific, rich mode of experiencing Judaism, full of the deepest and profoundest knowledge of classical, ancient, medieval, and modern Jewish literature, as well as, when he got to this country, the addition of William James and John Dewey and all the subjects that he studied when he went to college here. My concern is that so many people are given the erroneous impression that you can become a Reconstructionist on an empty stomach. That is to say, there's no need to have any knowledge of where the Jewish people come from. There's no need to have an in-depth knowledge of our sacred literature, which is a literature that covers a period of some almost 3,000 years, but that simply by reciting certain slogans, by reciting certain political statements, by being able to make certain definitions in the English language, that somehow one is qualified as being a Reconstructionist. Unfortunately, that is not the case. And perhaps one of the most misunderstood statements that Rabbi Kaplan ever made the past has a vote, but not a veto. I think that statement has been more misunderstood than anything he ever wrote, because it says the past has a vote, but many Reconstructionists today, who I hear and I read, give me the impression that the present is all that is important in arriving at a conclusion. The present needs present insights and present ideas. The past should not be tyrannical, but without the past, without the richness of Jewish tradition, there can be no reconstruction. We are reconstructing nothing. And so the past, the vote that the past has, is a crucially important vote, and that has to be considered. And therefore you may have noticed that one of the most distinct features of our worship service here is that we tend not to have responsive English readings, which I find turn me off in a quest for a spiritual mode of life. We used to have many English readings, and some of the finest English readings of the last 100 years, in fact, came from the pen of Mordecai Kaplan. There is a magic and a mystique in the Hebrew language which cannot be gainsaid. It is not like Latin to the Roman Catholic. The Catholic Church, I think they made a mistake, gave up Latin because they felt that they wanted to introduce the Mass in the language of the vernacular. They didn't ask me, but I could have told them from the word go that they were making a big mistake, that all religions need an area where the very obscurity and mysteriousness of what is being done encourage the imaginative dimensions of the human spirit, which play such an important role in the quest for soul and for the spiritual meaning of life. For us, Hebrew is a living language. First of all, it is spoken in Eretz Yisrael and throughout the world wherever Israelis live. A central part of being a Reconstructionist, in my book, is having a nodding acquaintance with the Hebrew language in any shape or form. If you want it to be modern Hebrew, fine. You want it to be medieval Hebrew, fine. You want it to be rabbinic Hebrew, fine. You want it to be biblical Hebrew, fine. But don't come to a Reconstructionist synagogue and then go back to your friends and say, it's marvelous, I'm a Reconstructionist and I don't need to know Hebrew because the service is in English. I know Rabbi Kaplan, and I can tell you right now that it is a travesty of everything that the founder of Reconstructionism wrote or thought. Hebrew is a central gift of our civilization. It is our language. It is a vehicle of meaning. Whatever else Marshall McLuhan meant when he said, there we have, I'm quoting a Canadian, how about that? The medium, he said, is the message. What he meant was that there are certain crucial situations in human intercourse where what is being done is not half as important as the way it is being done. Let's give you an example here this morning. It may well be from a Marshall McLuhan standpoint that my remarks to you this morning are mere noise, that the sermon or the talk or the lecture or the discussion in any synagogue is mere noise, and that what is crucially important is the fact that we get together and we do certain things which need not necessarily appeal to our conscious rational mind, that we perform some kind of a cult, some kind of a ritual, that the strength of what we are doing is that we are doing it and that we are repeating it. There was an extraordinarily interesting article in the New York Times a few weeks ago which described how 19th century music has become mythological for modern Americans, certainly, and how the repetition of Brahms and Beethoven and Mendelssohn and Bach and the other great writers from the past, it's not exclusively 19th century, but how we tend to avoid the modern idiom, how if you try to give a concert in which all the items are by John Cage, you simply won't have a full house, that there is a certain need to repeat the way children like to repeat stories. It may well be that the entire service comes under that guise, but certainly it is a total misunderstanding of what Reconstructionism means and what its founders said, to believe that there is any way of letting Jews off the hook in respect of learning Hebrew. We had people come to me and say, I can't join this synagogue, there's too much Hebrew, to which my response was, then learn. You can't have a Reconstructionist synagogue anywhere which can satisfy the people who come to it where they are at. If that is the case, if people are joining Reconstructionist synagogues because those synagogues make them feel comfortable where they are at, then those synagogues are a travesty of Reconstructionism. We aim to have synagogues to serve congregants not where they are at, but where they ought to be at. And we should not be ashamed of telling people who want to join us, we respect you and we cherish you, but we cannot share your current goals for meaningful Jewish life. They are not ours. It may take you 5 years before you can become a member of this congregation and feel that this is part of you. We will help. We will do everything we can to train you, to teach you, to give you study courses, to help you, to make it as easy we can. We will not tell you that this congregation is ready for you now, because where Jews are when they come to us from the cold is not where we can gear any kind of meaningful congregational life to. And I not only refer to the non-churched or non-synagogue Jews who come, I refer even to the refugees from Orthodox Judaism. All Jews who come from outside need to learn how to be Reconstructionists. And the first lesson is to understand where we come from. To be a Jew, to belong to some part of the Jewish community, to belong, that's the first thing. I sometimes talk about this in terms of the 3 B's. Belonging, behaving, and believing. And notice that the faith business, I believe in God or whatever, comes last. First you belong somewhere. There's no way you can talk about being Jewish without having become a member somewhere. As a Reconstructionist, it doesn't have to be in a congregation or even in a chavurah. It could be in B'nai B'rith if it's an active chapter. It could even be an American Jewish Congress or committee if it's an active chapter. But you have to belong somewhere. You can't just sit on the sidelines and have warm feelings in your stomach when you read the New York Times on a Saturday morning in Central Park. You have to belong somewhere. You have to be with other Jews. You have to share their concerns. You have to spend time on behalf of other Jews, whether it's marching for Russian Jews or marching for Israel or giving money. Yes, giving money. That's also important. It's not the only thing, but it's very important. It's not the only thing. So therefore, those who give money are not gods to be worshipped. That's something else that Reconstructionist synagogues should do well to look into. We shouldn't pander to people because they are poor, and we shouldn't pander to them because they're rich. We shouldn't pander to them because they're illiterate, and we shouldn't pander to them because they know a great deal. We should try to create a meaningful Jewish existence. The first teaching of Reconstructionism is be a Jew, belong. And the first answer to anybody who says, what is a Reconstructionist Jew? The first answer is, being a Reconstructionist, first and foremost, means being a Jew. The first commitment we have is to what is not denominational and what causes us to feel part of the family of the Jewish people world over, to a greater or lesser extent. We can't feel as close to the Jew in Kiev and Moscow, or even in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem sometimes, as we do to those who live next door to us on West 86th Street. But it is a state of mind. The Jewish people is our people, and nothing that affects the ongoing advancement and enhancement of the Jewish people can be alien to us. That is the first affirmation of Reconstructionism, and it doesn't even mention the word. And so the Hebrew language is something which you ought to take to heart, and I hope you will take back to your congregations, if they don't have these traditions already, the notion that the service and the way in which the congregation is run should not be in the hands of the professionals, but that the role of the professional is to enable and facilitate the rank and file members of the congregation to do everything that the professionals can do, which means that every rank and file member of the congregation should regard it as a pride and privilege to learn how to chant 3 verses from the Sidra in Hebrew with a correct cantillation once in a blue moon, even once in a year. And that every year or so, every member of the congregation, male or female, should study and prepare a haftarah. And that there are parts of the service which be conducted by members of the congregation throughout the year and during the period in the summer when the rabbi takes a vacation and suns himself on the beach. This is not just something that's trivial. You can't be part of a community until you become an active part of the community. The best way to join a congregation is to become a committee as soon as you've signed a member of the committee, as soon as any kind of committee. It's only when you share and you work together that you feel part of the community. Belong as a Jew. That is the first Reconstructionist message I give you today. And the second message is behave as a Jew. Have respect for the traditions and rituals that come down from the past. We have reintroduced the traditional prayer book in this congregation not because we've gone back to orthodoxy as such, but we could not avoid noticing that the way in which the early Reconstructionists rebelled against Father Orthodoxy was the kind of thing many of us see in our own homes. Nothing that Mummy does is right. Nothing that Daddy does is right. They're all wrong. We have to make a clean break. When I get married and I raise my children, says the daughter, it's going to be nothing like what you're doing here. I'm going to do it all on my own, quite new. Well, we all said this to our own parents. We all even fondly believed it. And we all know when push comes to shove, how much we are flesh and blood and bone of those whom we grew up in the shadow of, how difficult it is to shift the slightest dimension of any of the patterns which we all had inherited long before we reached the tender age of 7 years old, and how important it is for us to ultimately learn to respect and to love our parents. Sometimes I think that the whole goal of life is to learn to be able, at least one day before we die, really to forgive our parents for what they did to us. If only just for 1 hour before we die, we could say to our mothers and fathers, we forgive you and we love you. That would be the goal of life. Now, in this early rebellion against Orthodox tradition, it was absolutely appropriate that the Reconstructionist movement should get rid of the traditional prayer book altogether. It was absolutely imperative they should reintroduce concepts such as the new Haggadah and the new prayer book, a Reconstructionist prayer book, which differed in many respects radically from the old. The first stage of adolescent rebellion is to clear the decks, have an absolute, total, clean break with the past. When both parent and child, after a certain amount of skirmishing, have realized that a break has been made, the umbilical cord has been severed, father has been killed, metaphorically speaking, hopefully, mother has been separated from totally, the umbilical cord has been cut, daughter is a separate entity, then and only then can mother and daughter and father and son sit down and begin to talk together and discuss and learn to relish the fact that they really have a great deal in common, and that the daughter and the son really have learned a great deal from their mother and father, and that the daughter and the son are very proud to incorporate into their own personal lives and ultimately their family lives and their nuclear family lives when the children arrive, patterns of behavior they picked up from their mothers in their mothers dealing with them, and how much joy it can give after the rebellion has successfully taken place, and after the dragons have been slain, and only then, the joy that comes of acknowledging, baby woke up in the middle of the night, and you remember what you did? I did the same thing, and I realized I'd learned it from you. But until that point takes place, until the break has been made, there is no way in which an authentic acknowledgement and respect can be made for the past. It was essential that the Reconstructionist movement go through its adolescent rebellion and say to orthodoxy, which was the father, we want nothing of you. You are alien, you are strange, you are different, and we want to be our own persons, or we are going to go it alone. That age has passed. We have made it quite clear that we reject Orthodox Judaism in its theological perspective from every point of view. No one who comes to this synagogue and observes us, observes the way in which the traditional prayer book, even when it is used, is our servant and not our master. How we use it to anthologize, how we use it to abstract, how we use it as a source of discussion, how we use it in a limited mode as a form of repeating traditional prayers from the past. At no point does it exercise over us the mastery which it had for the first generation of Reconstructionists, nor does it have for us the same fear. We are no longer afraid of it, therefore we can approach it in love. And therefore we have learned to realize that some of the greatest traditional liturgical beauties still lie in the past. And there is a point in the life of the individual, as in the life of the group, when sometimes, in limited controlled circumstances, going backwards is more progress than going forwards. Progression does not always mean a geographical moving forward. Sometimes it can also mean a going backwards. That is one area in which I feel we can draw your attention to a way in which in this synagogue Reconstructionism has entered a new stage. We are no longer so close to that horrible first battle with the Orthodox dragon that we need to feel afraid of introducing old traditions into Jewish life. And so if somebody will raise the question of selling chametz at the ritual committee during the course of this year, the issue, which was indeed raised by several members of the congregation with me, we will discuss the concept intelligently and try to understand the purpose that is served. It would have been unthinkable as recently as 10 years ago for somebody to ask the question and for somebody to even entertain that we might look into the meaning of such a tradition to see whether it might bring any meaning and purpose into our lives. The break has been made. We can afford to love the dragon and not constantly worry about when it's going to set the house on fire again. In theological matters, the rebellion has been of a different order. If in respect of ritual, if in respect of observing the Sabbath, or Kashrut, or Hoshana Rabbah, or Sukkot, or Pesach, encouraging members of the congregation to conduct their own Seder services. One of the most beautiful, beautiful letters I ever received from any member of this congregation was a letter I received after this Passover, which somebody who came from a background where he was not able to conduct a Seder service by himself claimed, as a result of being in the SAJ, learning Hebrew, going to the workshops, for the first time this year, that young man conducted a Seder service for his family which he felt was infinitely meaningful. That's the kind of thing we're looking for. It's not enough just to belong as a Jew and let the rabbi and the cantor do the work for you. To belong as a Jew means to learn what to do so as to behave as a Jew. And as every Jew's birthright should be the right to be able to stand up in front of the congregation and daven, even for 5 minutes, to get up in front of the congregation and lane, even 3 verses, to get up in front of the congregation and recite a traditional haftarah, and to conduct your own Seder service, to recite Kiddush at home on Friday night, to be able to make a hamotzi. All these things appear to be so trivial, yet once you have mastered them and made them your own, only you will know what an accession of religious meaning those traditions have done. It looks ridiculous from the standpoint of an outsider. A person can come and say, what do you want of me? I've managed to live for 30 years without observing anything. I want to become a member of the congregation, but why do I have to do anything? There's no way in which I can tell him. Most often, he rubs shoulders with some other member of the congregation who shares with him or her what a radical change learning to be a Jew, or as Zalman Schachter puts it, learning to Jew, learning to behave as a Jew. And you will not know it until you do it yourself. It's like learning to ride a bicycle. It's like learning how to swim. You think you'll never do it, but once you master it, you will suddenly have truly come of age as a Jew. And nobody will have had to give you a fountain pen to demonstrate it. You will have done it all yourselves. The realm where I think, at least from this pulpit, we have broken away from the first level or the first stage of Reconstructionism in a more avant-garde, progressive way, relates to the matter of theology. It's very hard, it would be very difficult for me in the space of a few moments to say to you all that Rabbi Kaplan has to say about the idea of God. And for my part, I prefer not to start a discussion of Reconstructionism in terms of the idea of God, because that's where most Reconstructionist discussions get bogged down. And the issue seems to be exclusively, do you believe in a supernatural God or don't you believe in a supernatural God? To me, the first 2 prongs of this threefold challenge to belong as a Jew and behave as a Jew is far more important than believing. We don't have a word in classical Hebrew for believing. We have a word which means being confident in something, the word amen. The he'emin b'Adonai, which the Torah says of Abraham, doesn't mean Abraham believed in God. It means he had confidence. But the confidence that he had in God came from the fact that he was involved with the family in attempting to make whatever was Judaism at that point in time work. The notion of believing in is a Greek and a Christian concept. It is not a truly Jewish notion. Rabbi Kaplan's idea of God is a confused idea. He doesn't have a single idea of God, and that's why in all the years he preached from this pulpit, he was never able to convince us that we really understood what he was talking about. The best we can do is to go through all his writings and to draw attention to the fact that there are at least two distinct ideas of God in Mordecai Kaplan's writings. In one of these ideas, I'll begin with the one that I feel closest to. The term God is a shorthand symbol for all those aspects of our life as human beings, in respect of ourselves as individuals, in respect of our relationships with our immediate families and our extended families, and in respect of our relationships to our communities, our peoples, both Jewish and American, or Jewish and Canadian, or Jewish and anything else. The term God is used as a shorthand symbol for all those aspects of all those concentric circles of relationships on which we depend for our salvation. That is to say, for our meaningful life. The term God is a shorthand word. It's a symbol. It's a word we use to account for all those aspects of our lives which we subsume under the rubric of the holy, the spiritual, the meaningful, the Jewish, the Hebraic, the traditional. But in another sense, Kaplan uses the term God as if God actually is something. Not somebody, but something. He talks about a power, capital P, making for salvation. And when you read those parts of his writings in which he is talking about God as a power that makes for salvation, you're onto something that is very close to what the French philosopher Bergson described as an élan vital. That is to say that in the cosmos there is some kind of a friendly, loving striving. It's not a thing, it's not a person, but it's a kind of a force, something like gravity, which somehow cooperates with men when men cooperate with it, and somehow is going to try to bring about a better kind of a world than the world than we have already. I can't think of any good words to use because it's a difficult concept. There is a word in English, in the English language, called nisus, N-I-S-U-S. It's a Latin word. It means striving. I think of it somehow as a Casper the Friendly Ghost without a Casper. It's as if the cosmos on some level is saying to all of us, come along, bubbler, you can do it, except there's no voice. God as the power making for salvation. You yourselves, yes?
I think Obi-Wan Kenobi might refer to it as the Force.
Right, wonderful, wonderful. I hope all of you saw that movie or was dragged to that movie by one of your teenagers. What was the first one called? Star Wars. There was no question about it that when Alec Guinness began burbling about the Force, every Reconstructionist in the congregation knew what he was talking about. It's some kind of élan vital. It's some kind of a drive in the cosmos that somehow can be harnessed by man. I very much regret to say that this second conception of God, which Rabbi Kaplan talks about in great detail and which has embarrassed most of his commentators, concerning which Harold Weisberg, who wrote an essay on the topic in one of the many books published by the Jewish Reconstructionist Press, sometimes he says, we really need what we have in the Bible, tikkun sofrim. The scribes went through the Bible, and when they saw words which they felt were slightly vulgar or not quite appropriate to read in public in the synagogue, they allowed the word to remain, but they altered the way the word was pronounced, so that a word that referred to something vulgar was pronounced as if it referred to something nicer. I'll give you just one example. There are many. In the Bible, the god of the indigenous Canaanite nature worshippers, the social god, was called the social god, not the natural god. The social god, the god of the community, was called Moloch or Molech. Now, the word Molech is an application to the Hebrew word melech of the vowels that come from a word which they didn't want to pronounce, which is boshet, which means a shanda, a disgrace. What they did was take the punctuation from the bad word and place it on the good word. That's what I'm talking about in reverse. The other way of doing it is when you have a bad word which you don't want to say, and you put another pronunciation on it. What Harold Weisberg said, rather interestingly, was maybe someday somebody should go through Kaplan's writings and apply the principle of tikkun sofrim, and whenever anything looks a little bit too supernaturalistic, punctuate it differently so that it reads supernaturalist but it sounds natural. Well, of course, you can't quite do that. And some of the prayers, I asked you to prove this to you yourselves. I have no secrets and no magic. I am simply telling you like it is. Read the Reconstructionist High Holiday Prayer Book. Look in the back. Look at those prayers that Kaplan wrote. Read those English prayers which Kaplan wrote, and you tell yourself whether that is a naturalistic God or a God who is believed to be able to do something about the universe, a God who is really a supernaturalistic God on some level, but, you know, only a little so. Unfortunately, supernaturalism is like being pregnant. You can't be a little supernaturalist. You're either pregnant, or you know the story. You're either pregnant or you're not. You're either a supernaturalist and you're not. And one of the most painful things for some of us in the 20th century is to see how people wriggle and wrestle and slither and slide in their desperate attempt to be a little pregnant. One of the best examples I can think of is, of course, the sociologist Peter Berger, who, like Kaplan, is divided into two people. Half of Peter Berger is a devout sociologist who accepts rigid academic axioms and presuppositions and methodology for everything he does, and the other is a devout, believing Christian who believes that a man, Jesus, was on some real level the Son of God, was crucified, died, was resurrected, and will come again. Now, that's very hard. That's a hard act to get together. And so what Berger does is constantly say, I am a sociologist, but tries to bring a little bit of his supernaturalistic contraband across the frontier. And so he writes a book called A Rumor of Angels, which I would translate in, another title might have been, On Being a Little Pregnant, supernaturalistically speaking. A rumor of angels. Notice what he's saying. He's not saying there are angels. He's just saying, I was walking in Central Park the other night and I thought I heard a feather. I thought I heard a wing make a move. I have tried for the last 20 years from this pulpit to try to make sense of this notion, and I've come to the conclusion that there's no way of doing that. We have to place more stress in our 1982 understanding of Reconstructionism on the word evolving. The term evolution is itself going through an evolution. Reconstructionism cannot stand still. When we speak of Judaism as an evolving religious civilization, do we truly understand what we mean by evolution? Can we really accept the hard, painful, objective fact of man's condition in the modern world? It took a Copernicus to draw our attention to the fact that we were not geographically the center of the universe. It took a Darwin to remind us that animals and humans descend from the same ultimate stock, and that human beings aren't a little divine, although that's what the psalmist wanted, a little pregnant. I mean, isn't that what the psalmist says? This Peter Berger joke has been going on for thousands of years. What else is the psalmist doing when he says, "Vatchasrehu me'at me'elohim"? You know that beautiful psalm? What is man that thou art mindful of him? Thou hast made him little lower than the angels. That's a Peter Berger enterprise, little low. What does that mean, little lower than the angels? Either you're an angel or you're not an angel. You can't be a little lower than the angels. Again, this is a desperate attempt to try to save something, to save our self-respect. Darwin showed us that we were animals that had learned how to sublimate some of the most bestial aspects of our animality. And what Newton and Einstein and Freud and Marx and ultimately Kaplan at his most naturalistic had to teach us was there are no chosen peoples of any kind, shape or form. Man is not a chosen animal. The Jew is not a chosen people. The earth is not a chosen piece of cosmic matter. Now, to create a meaningful religion on the basis of a rather painful awareness of our aloneness in the cosmos, that all the values which we create in our religious strivings are man-made. True, they are man-made within the cosmos, and the laws whereby those spiritual insights are developed are laws which we ourselves did not create ourselves. But nevertheless, these laws, although they do have a special application for human beings since we are self-conscious, apply universally. The same principle whereby Rabbi Kaplan derives his understanding of God as a function of the group, that is to say, God, this is Durkheim's insight, that God is a social fact, applies equally to Nazism and to communism as it does to Judaism. The same laws which bring us to synagogue brought the Nazis to their Nuremberg rallies and make the Russians have their May Day. They all know, as we do, that the group generates divinity. But the question still remains, shall that divinity be ethical, or shall that divinity be unethical? And that argument never ceases, because there's no way of proving ultimately that our ethics are superior to yours. All that we can do is do the best we can with the limited material available. So here we at the SAJ stand in 1982. We are enormously privileged here to have had the leader of Reconstructionism preach from this pulpit, enormously enriched by the fact that we heard him ourselves with all the clarity and all the truth and sometimes all the confusion. We have his writings. We are living in a changing universe, and we know and we feel that to repeat simply verbatim ideas which were written 50 or 60 years ago cannot be valid in the modern world where so much is changing. We need to follow the implications of where evolution is taking us today. We need to understand that it is very important to have some communal enclave in Jewish life where Jews who want to be Jews, who want to conduct Seder service, who want to learn Hebrew, who want to daven, who want to do all the things that other Jews have done, but who have enormous difficulty with being a little pregnant, in a supernaturalistic sense, have a right to be. I suppose ultimately what really makes this synagogue different from other synagogues, either yours or other synagogues where you may be, is not necessarily the form of service that we have. After all said and done, other congregations have Hebrew, other congregations have people who sing Haftarot, maybe not as many women, but certainly do those things, conduct their own Seder service. This is taken for granted. What is the distinction? And here we get to the very end of the 3 B's. The first one was belonging, the second was behaving, and the third was believing. Belief is important. It comes, however, after other things have been considered. You can't find your way to a belief in a Jewish God unless you go through the other 2 B's first. You can't believe before you belong and behave. You've got to belong and behave before you can believe. You know, a person can want to become a therapist and can know all the books and all the words and all the right things to say and yet be a total failure. You know why? Because it's not going through here and here. It's just going from one book to another book. It's not something that's felt and experienced. There's no way to learn how to believe in God by reading Kaplan's books. You can stay home and read Kaplan's books till the cows come home, and you'll never understand the first thing about being a Reconstructionist. To believe as a Reconstructionist, you must belong and you must behave. We would do better in our striving to bring more Jews under the Reconstructionist sway, to invite them to our services and show them what we do, rather than send them pamphlets and tell them what to read. More will be gained by sharing an act of worship and study than the best propaganda handouts. Ultimately, people will catch the Reconstructionist virus by contact, not by reading a medical textbook. If we want to convince them of the value of what we cook, the best thing is to get them to sit down and eat a meal, not to send them a list of recipes. No one was ever won over to a form of cooking by reading cookbooks. You have to eat the meal. Now, this is a very difficult blend. On the one hand, we feel that the early Reconstructionists threw out a great deal that was valuable, both in terms of Haftarah readings, both in terms of Torah readings, many of which we have reintroduced, Psalms, which were bowdlerized and annotated and abridged, without a real concern beyond the limited area of a kind of a liberal, Victorian, naive optimism, which is not available to us after 2 world wars and the Holocaust and the tragedies which face the state of Israel in its attempt to pursue an elusive peace. We feel somehow the tradition addresses the human condition far better than the early innovations of the Reconstructionists. So be it. We move on. In this respect, we go back to the original texts, which we wrestle with and study. We don't agree with everything that they say, but we insist on understanding what they meant before we so cavalierly disagree with them and reject them. In the realm of theology, I at least have found it impossible to follow Rabbi Kaplan's rumor of a supernatural power that makes for salvation. I understand when he speaks about the whole being greater than the sum of the parts, but then I know that that applies for Hitler and Stalin as well as for Roosevelt. It applies for everybody. The ultimate issue is, do we believe that value is generated by societies, by human beings working and living together, or is there some external power or force in the world which has control over the ultimate operation of the cosmos? That is the issue to which we have addressed ourselves here. And we've come up with something which is not as comforting as the power that makes for salvation. We've come up with the notion that life is a random walk. We've come up with the notion that there is no rhyme or reason the way history works out the way it does. That our lives are contingent, but not necessary. That things happen to have worked out the way they worked out, but they didn't have to work out this way. That nevertheless, even though every last vestige of narcissistic support has been removed from us by Marx and Freud and Darwin and Copernicus and Kaplan at his most naturalistic, we prefer to choose to be part of our group, to cherish the symbols our ancestors bequeathed to us, and to ask all those Jews who are uncomfortable, professing to believe what they don't really believe, to join us in our search. What we say is not gospel. All those babies who are growing up in this synagogue today, when they become of age, will no doubt turn this synagogue topsy-turvy as we try to do in our time. I only hope we make it a little easier for them than the elder generation made it for us. At least we will know that they are truly reflecting the best that we felt we could do when the time came for us. And as for you young people who came from all these different areas, if you feel that there are any institutions and practices and behaviors in your congregations that you would like us to adopt, we would be delighted to hear from you. If you would write me a letter and tell me where you feel we fell short this morning. We have this habit, we have this custom. And secondly, if you feel there is anything you can learn from us, we'll be very happy to try to teach you whatever we can. Now, we do have some time left, and I wonder whether perhaps members of the congregation or our visitors would like to either respond, agree or disagree with what I've said, or ask questions, because we would like to tell you that one of the things we have introduced at the SAJ over the years, and it hasn't remained static. Originally we had something called the open microphone. People used to come and talk from down there, and then when the 60s passed, we decided we needed to have a little more authority in the synagogue, so we moved the microphone back again. But basically the same principle still operates, that this congregation believes in learning by a process of dialectic, process of give and take, of sharing, asking questions. So if there are any observations or questions which any of you would like to make, please, this is the time to do it. Yes?
Why should we go through the efforts of, I forget which were the first two you said, behaving as
Belonging and behaving.
and behaving as, if we cannot prove that our system of ethics is better than the other person? Or does that mean?
I'll repeat that question. Why should we go through the business of belonging and behaving if we don't believe, in order to get to believing, if we don't believe that our ethics are superior to any other group of people. You're addressing yourself to his question. Thank you. Would you turn around and face the congregation? They can hear you better. Leah, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to sit down, and I know you won't mind, because one of our young visitors has his hand up, and I'm going to give them priority. Please. Don't let me down now. You just had your hand up. Would you like to stand? And you put your yarmulke on too. Make yourself at home. Leah, I'm sorry.
We have to feel that we have a superior set of values, would you say?
Me, no. He said that. I didn't say that. He said the question was, and that's why I want you to address yourself to. I said that there were three things. As I understand it, I was boiling Reconstructionism down to what I call the three Bs. I could have put it more fancifully. Belonging could be simply stated in the classical Hebrew term Ahavat Yisrael, the love of the Jewish people. Okay? The second, behaving, observing the mitzvot to a greater or less extent, could be described as Ahavat Torah, the importance of the Jewish way of life. And the third B is believing Ahavat Hashem, the love of God, in whichever way we arrive at it. And I said, you can't get to number 3 unless you go through number 1 and number 2 first. So in a sense, number 1 and 2, you go through in a kind of a suspended state of suspension. Because you have to believe that when you get through to the end, something will happen that didn't happen before, but you've got to go through all the other bits before you get to the end. I'm sure every one of us could find some analogy in other areas where you have to do certain things on trust before you get to a point where you can really, it's like going to Est. Oh, come on, no snorting. Okay, now you ask your, now he then said, why should I go through the first 2 if I'm not convinced that what I'll get in number 3 is a set of ethics superior to any other group?
I don't know about whether we should have a set of ethics that is superior to any other group. I think we should have a set of ethics that is superior to ourselves. I think that other groups, they want to do it, but that is superior to us.
That was beautifully said. What's your name? Where are you from? Chicago. Thank God the message has got to Chicago. There are Reconstructionists in Chicago. You said that beautifully, and you answered the question beautifully, and if Rabbi Kaplan were here, he would have embraced you. What you said was that we don't have to have ethics that are superior to any other people in order to go through those traditions and those commitments which are part of being born as a Jew. You see, the essence of what Rabbi Kaplan was trying to tell us is that basically you don't choose to be Jewish, unless, of course, you become converted to Judaism, which is also a possibility. But for the most part, we don't choose to be Jewish, we are born Jewish. That is to say, you are born in a certain family, and you wake up one morning and you realize you are Jewish. The question is, what are you going to do with something you already are? Are you going to run away from it, or embrace it and try to make it meaningful? Those Jews who reject Judaism never really have come to terms with what they have rejected. And every person who rejects something about themselves, whether they reject their height and pretend that it doesn't bother them when it really does, reject the color of their eyes, or the shape of their figure, or the kind of skin they've got, or the color of hair they've got, or the kind of brain they've got, or the kind of family they've got. All of us have to accept the fact that some of the most crucial dimensions of our lives are not subject to our control. Where we are born, to whom we are born, the language we speak, the reality we have, our sex, the kind of person we're going to marry. The question is, what are we going to do about it? And I like the way Dave from Chicago put that. He put it beautifully. He said, the crucial question is whether our ethics meet our own standards, whether our own ethics give us a sense of growing and becoming something. And I would like to just tie this bit up by quoting from one of Rabbi Kaplan's books, Judaism in Transition, where he says, when you write a diary, it doesn't have to be as good as the great diaries of the great world writers like Samuel Pepys in order for you to like it. You keep a diary not because it measures up to a diary that Shakespeare might have written, or Bertrand Russell might have written, or Wordsworth, or Shelley, or Keats. You write a diary because it's yours. The exploits that you describe, the things you encounter, the people you meet, don't have to be Alexander the Great and Aristotle and Plato. They are people who matter to you. It's your life. It's your diary. By the same token, when we are raising our children as Jews, our heroes don't have to be bigger and better than the heroes of the French and the Americans and the Germans. Our values don't have to be superior. The things that we did, the exodus from Egypt, the expulsion from Spain, our wanderings, how we became Jews, the literature that we wrote, doesn't have to be. But the only real regret I have was that Bach wasn't a Chazan. And that the St. Matthew Passion wasn't something we could do on Yom Kippur in the middle of the day. That's my only real regret. Or the Bach Mass in B minor couldn't be set to Yiddish. Because somehow in religious music, I don't know, in that respect, I have reservations. But what Dave reminded us of was that our wives, our husbands, our children don't have to be better than anybody else on the block. They're ours. We learn to live with them as we do with ourselves, with our positive and negative traits, the good and the bad. That's what being Jewish is. That's the essence, by the way, of Kaplan's attitude towards the chosen people. We are unique. Everybody is unique, but nobody is chosen. Yes. No, I'm sorry. If we're getting back to congregation, Leah has a point now. If any of our visitors want to speak, I would be very, very happy if you would say whatever you want to say about what we're talking about this morning. Yes.
Actually, I think between you and the gentleman from Chicago, you pretty much said it all. I was going to say, do we have to be better in order to be Americans? Canadian, English, whatever. The point is... Watch it down there. I got some jingoists in the front row. Okay, whatever. The point is that we're born what we're born, and the question is what we do with it. And I don't think that it's really relevant whether it's better or worse. It's ours, as you said, and that's what's important.
That is what Kaplan is talking about when it comes to the chosen people. Nobody is better. Everybody can be as good as they can make themselves, which is what the young man was talking about. Yes, Roberta? Will you stand up? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that. I'm sorry, I didn't hear your question.
I believe that the concept of the chosen people is just that I didn't choose to be Jewish. I chose to accept the fact that I was born Jewish, just as I accept other aspects of my life. But if that's what we believe is Reconstructionist, then why do we change the words and the prayers about the chosen people?
Well, this will get us into a lot of deep trouble. I have to tell you honestly that I could live with the Asher Bachabanu in the same way that I live at home with Kivanu Vachata for the Kiddush on Friday night. And as I noticed most members of the retreat did, I shut up at that line this year at the retreat, and I was interested in seeing what the majority voice would say. I think we made a mistake. I think we made a mistake because, as the bracha is now, those of us who have been following my own theological interpretations of the last 20 years or so realize that Asher Kirvanu presents as much theological problem as Asher Bachabanu in some way. And the problem was we became divisive. We separated from other Jews and gave ourselves a problem in terms of belonging. I don't think we've gained very much from it. I think we've lost by making people break their teeth when they come up to the bima and don't recognize our bracha. And as you noticed this morning, one of the gentlemen who came to the bima, who was a rabbi, said Asher Bachabanu, so we still permit people to say Asher Bachabanu anyway. The only area in the traditional prayer book which I couldn't live with is the Aleinu prayer. When it says Shelo Asanu Kol Goyei Haratzot, which casts aspersions and puts down non-Jews, this I couldn't live with. The Aleinu, the first paragraph of the Aleinu prayer. Otherwise, I must tell you, I could live with the entire corpus of the traditional prayer book, but of course not all at the same time. It would have to be excerpted from. Rabbi Kaplan, however, we must not Monday morning quarterback him. At the time Rabbi Kaplan was doing his Reconstructionist rebellion, that was the adolescent rebellion of this movement, and we had to make a clean break. And the more radical the break was, the healthier it was for those of us who came later. We are only able to do what we are doing now because Kaplan did what he did then. Do you hear what I'm saying? If that rebellion had not been of the order that it was then, if we had not served the Jewish people as a whole notice that we do not accept your theology, burn our book if you want to, a second generation could not have come along and had a second look at Orthodox Judaism, minus its defects, and realize that some of the traditional material is much too good to throw away. Linda? Oh, come on, Linda. Thanking God for not being a woman? I don't know. I think I'm pretty reconciled to the fact that I'm a man. I'm not sure that I regard the way most people react to that in the traditional prayer book with such vehemence. I think it's a loaded reaction. All that the traditional Jew was trying to say was, and this is the original meaning of that blessing, that in Jewish tradition, whether you accept it or not, we obviously have difficulties with the role of woman in rabbinic tradition, that since the woman is not obliged to perform certain mitzvot, and since the central goal of life in terms of rabbinic theology is to be able to perform as many mitzvot as possible, the Orthodox Jew thanks God for not being a woman because he has so many more mitzvot to observe. But certainly we find that that blessing is so offensive to women in the 20th century that it remains in the book merely as evidence of a particular theological viewpoint. I don't think it's fair to read Betty Friedan into that blessing. I believe that the ancients have a right to be understood in their original context. And in its original context, I find that blessing is not offensive. And incidentally, you will find plenty of Jewish women, both traditional and non-traditional, who can share that viewpoint. Unfortunately, in this era of feminism, certain things can't be heard because of certain strident ways of approaching certain themes, but things are beginning to change in different directions. Do we have any of the students who would like to respond to anything that was said this morning? I can't believe that only the SAJ students have voices. Yes, Canada, please stand. What's your name? Stanley? Sandy? Sandy. Okay. Would you turn around and face the congregation? I will hear you from the back of your head.
Have a little bit of a different opinion, and each rabbi would have their own opinion, and neither would you know. And I think that's what this is.
That wasn't a question, it was a kind of a statement. Sandy was drawing attention to the fact that she feels that her own rabbi and I might not agree on all points. Of course, the notion of not agreeing on all points is not something that the Reconstructionist movement created in Jewish history. I'm sure all of you know that one of the biggest disagreements that took place in ancient times was the disagreement between the so-called schools of Hillel and the schools of Shammai. And ultimately, of course, the decision was in terms of the school of Hillel, but when the rabbis came to that conclusion, a voice was heard saying, Elu va'elu divrei Elohim chayim. Both the words of the school of Shammai and the words of the school of Hillel are the words of the living God, and the halakha is according to the school of Hillel. I like to think that the crucial matter is not whether one agrees or disagrees, but the sense, the context in which one agrees or disagrees. Whether the agreement or disagreement is, I would say, l'shem shamayim, for the sake of making the Reconstructionist movement more meaningful, more committed, and more involved in the love of Israel, the love of Torah, and the love of God, or whether, as is the problem with all modernist movements, whether we're just trying to make things easy for people, whether we're taking the least line of resistance, whether we're trying not to pressure people in order to encourage them to join something which really doesn't demand from them as much as should be demanded of them. In other words, letting people get away with the lowest common denominator in religious matters instead of striving for a highest common factor. Jeff?
special to the Reconstructionists. We've got to have something else, because I think the Orthodox certainly behave a certain way. They feel they belong very strongly, and they certainly believe with all their hearts. But I have a feeling that many of them believe that ours is not to wonder why, ours is just to do or die. I don't think Reconstructionists feel that. The thing which attracted me so fervently and so strongly to this place, and only to this place, is that of all places that I'd ever seen, and my exposure wasn't that great, but of all places I'd ever seen, you strive for understanding far more than I've ever seen. You once put it in a sermon beautifully, you're the automotive mechanic. You don't just you put the key and turn the engine on and the car goes. You want to find out why. You go down to the roots, you go into mythological prehistory, Freudian analysis, and the dynamics of the psyche, which I think really do hit at why Orthodox seem to behave the way they do, but they don't know it because they don't examine their own dynamics.
Well, I think we have to acknowledge that we can't use any of these names in a global general sense. Anybody who has any acquaintance with Orthodox Judaism today knows that under that heading you have a whole wide variety of different attitudes to some of the most crucial matters possible. Judith?
I just want to respond to the remark you made about feminism by saying that feminism in this narrative has us reductive and less things being break from some of those traditions of the past that have been encapsulated. It can't then move to a second stage. And I think the reaction to language, because language really forms concepts, is part of that and very valid in this stage.
I think that's a very, very important point. I think this notion of rebellion and coming back again to one's sources is very, very important. I still would love to hear from our visitors. We have some adult visitors here this morning. Their reactions will be very, very welcome too. Well, you're a regular. I'm just trying to find... you're a regular. I'm trying to find... are you a visitor this morning, sir? All right. We'll let you talk then.
Thank you. I had the privilege of reading this with these past...
Could you make it very brief and make it a question or observation because we're running out of time?
My question is, why? I've attended services here for a few times, and what I seem to feel is lacking is an appreciation of the Hebrew poetry in our service, and perhaps even a teaching experience, that is to learn the beauty of the language through insertions, perhaps from time to time, of a Hebrew poem explained and illustrated through perhaps a song.
I've got your point. Thank you. I appreciate what you're saying. We have many gaps of that kind, but I don't know whether it's directly relevant to what we're discussing at this particular moment. Okay, come on, last comment from up there. Shout it out. Ex cathedra. This is our resident Lincoln Square Jew, by the way, I want you to know. Go on.
You were saying earlier that one is either a supernaturalist or one is not a supernaturalist, and is analogous to being pregnant. A few years ago, I would have totally agreed with that. Now, I'm beginning to think that there is actually a continuum of belief, and sometimes at various points we move along this continuum. That in the sense of an old man with a beard who speaks with a big voice and hands down a few tablets to Moshe on Mount Sinai is something that we are on one side of the continuum on. I don't know that belief is something that the word belief in a sense is incorrect. That it is possible through the act of behaving, through the act of belonging. The next word is not so much belief as it is a sense of the divine. And it's not something explicit, it's not something I believe or I do not believe. It is this continuum that comes out of the behavior, that comes out of the psyche, it comes out of the totality, and a sense of the divine, a vague sense, can and does emerge, and I think that sense is real.
Oh, I don't deny its reality. Nobody ever here denied spiritual reality or psychic reality. We simply argue about its source. We feel more strongly than you do, apparently, that its source is in the community, and it comes from people, and doesn't reside in cosmic space. We have, all right, very, very quickly, very, very quickly.
I'd be interested for you to hear that it used to, I've been here about 5 years, and I used to, whenever you said that God doesn't exist and there's no supernatural God, things used to explode in my head, like the entire universe of stars and planets just blew up. Now, on this kind of basis of a continuum, and now I feel like the congregation almost, or myself, is taking off on a spaceship. Instead of exploding, I'm taking off on the spaceship, and sometimes I think the motor comes out, and we're not going anywhere. But they were isolated. That's the way I feel when you say that.
Yes. Again, to me, the reality, the human reality and the spiritual reality is what counts, whatever its source. Whether, in fact, people fall in love because there is a god called Cupid who has bow and arrows and goes around, firing these things, or because of the laws that sociologists lay down, doesn't really make much difference as long as there is love. It's the reality that we're about. And if the synagogue can generate in people a sense of the spiritual, it seems to me whether you want to be on a continuum or either or makes very little difference. What we must concentrate on are the realities. The descriptions of the realities take place after those realities have been experienced. And we certainly don't feel isolated this morning with all these wonderful young people visiting us from all over the country. And on all your behalves, I wish them welcome and hope that they will enjoy the balance of their weekend and we'll meet again and that we'll hear from them again in the future. We rise for Aleinu on page 194.